What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni-sensei here with What if AZULA found a Chad boyfriend? AU Avatar, The Last Airbender. Part 4. If you enjoy this type of content, please gracefully strike the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Remember to check out the original story linked in the description. Without further ado, let's get into the legend of the man who tamed AZULA. With the 11th being given time off, most of the troops of the 11th took the opportunity to visit their families back in the home islands, or try establishing new ones in Zilong. The bastard Lieutenant Colonel Mosey had to be smuggled out to the docks to bypass the small mob of women waiting to throw themselves at him, with Li Ming having to make a show of waiting in the tea house to distract them. Lieutenant Koshi and half of the bodyguards took their turns to return home as well, with the head bodyguard supposedly scheduled for an arranged marriage. Bufang wished his brave leader all the best, and hoped that the lucky girl would be able to deal with long periods of her husband's absence, without resorting to things that made up half the damn stories for stage plays and novellas. The colonel seemed serious in offering to avenge any infidelity inflicted to the married and betrothed soldiers of the 11th, be they man or woman. NTR is a trash fetish, he declared, whatever that meant. Though with the young commander's origins, it shouldn't have been much of a surprise that he found the bonds of loyalty and family to be sacred, and that he was highly protective of his family. Guarantee of vengeance aside, the 11th Regiment was already rather generous with its perks. Thanks especially to the princess influence, those serving in the regiment not only enjoyed higher pay and pension, but wounded retirees got enough of a hazard reimbursement from the royal coffers to drag up peasant families into a comfortable middle-class life. Because Princess AZULA wanted to remind everyone that the 11th Regiment enjoyed her support, and to ensure that her soldiers would be better off than the other common rabble. And there's also the letters of recommendation with the princess' own seal to guarantee a new line of business if they didn't want teaching positions in the regiment's training grounds. Regardless of her intentions, the generosity and clear dedication to the 11th was more than enough to buy the loyalty of everyone in the regiment. Enough so that every time rumors came from the royal capital of some noble or another supposedly making light of the princess and her naive inexperience, there were a lot of volunteers eager to investigate the rumors. And spirits help you if you made light of her within earshot of any soldier of the 11th. The last time some brainless troops from the allied 21st Brigade in the 1st Assault Army made a crass joke about how the princess secured her regiment's loyalty, a one-sided brawl had broken out. Punishment on the 11th's side had been light, considering they were correcting a slight against the crown princess. Still, Bufang felt it was a shame that the brigade did not survive the encirclement. He'd have liked to get his own licks in at the crude insult. Unfortunately, Captain Ping had been unable to reach them in time. Supposedly, some reckless firebenders had knocked out earthbender projectiles in such a haphazard fashion that many of the boulders crashed onto the men of the 21st Brigade and blocked their retreat. At least her battalion had managed to secure the brigade's supplies and avenge their demise by putting the resources to good use. It was a damned shame, but alas, without any honor to avenge, the 3-month break granted to the regiment posed a new problem for Bufang. And unfortunately for him and his fellow bodyguards, it came in the form of his colonel. "It's a bad idea, sir," Shansu reiterated, though Colonel Xing only shrugged. "That's why I'm going in light. If there's trouble, I can quickly leave." Quan let out a heavy sigh. "Oui, sir. You can't go out alone, you know that. Especially after what happened with King Bumi. Nobody here wanted to have the colonel vulnerable again. Koshi would likely run across the sea to throttle each, and every one of them if he found out. Besides, Bufang joined in. It's obviously a trap, but it conveniently solves a few problems for me," Xing said, almost pouting like a boy his age might. "And just because it's a trap dash, you barely got a draw against the Mad King before," Quan stated firmly. "Going into Omashu will get you killed, sir. We cannot allow you to leave." Shansu nodded with some regret. "Please don't make us use the princess orders on you, sir." At the threat, the colonel finally backed down. Fine, fine. I won't take up King Bumi's invitation to go to Omashu. There was something about the way he strung the sentence that made the bodyguards frown with concern. At their collective stares, the young commander relented. Okay, I won't try to infiltrate the Earth Kingdom lines in any way. I won't even think of going near the front lines. Happy. Again, Bufang didn't like the way the colonel said what he did, but it was about the best answer they'd get out of him. Well, until the boy gave a triumphant grin, and they ended up just barely catching him sneaking into a boat in the middle of the night several days later. It took Bufang a lucky glance to notice the small, colonel-sized hole in the tapestry outside his room. A quick check into his room to confirm his absence, along with a letter with orders on the desk, and the bodyguards rushed out, alerting the patrols as well. It had been a subtle thing, but thankfully Scout Captain Sungo quickly locked onto the commander's trail and found him at the docks with a small sack over his shoulder. Colonel Xing had the decency to look ashamed as he was caught, with Captain Ruffin practically stomping over to drag the colonel out of the boat. I'll be writing to the princess about this, the captain hissed. And Kai and Run. Please don't, the colonel simply said as he let himself be dragged to solid ground. Some glares at the town guards nearby bought them some privacy. I just need to run a quick errand. Neither bodyguards, captains, nor soldiers looked amused at the sheepish grin the boy offered them. Look, it's impossible to explain, but I need to relay something to King Bumi. It doesn't have to be face to face. I just need to pass a message. You're right. It's impossible to explain, the usually quiet scout captain said with a raised eyebrow. Are you mad? The captain of the 5th Battalion asked with a rising voice. Yes, Colonel Xing immediately replied, catching Captain Ruffin off guard. But I'm not stupid. I'll just land near Omashu, drop off my message at a patrol, and then return. It won't take a month. Colonel, sir, Shansu interrupted, trying to calm things down. You know the risks are too high, and you know the regiment cannot afford to lose you. I'll be fine, the commander insisted. Sneaking into an Earth Kingdom city is not the same as sneaking into outskirt towns, Colonel, Captain Sungo stated flatly. That's why I'm not going to sneak into the city. Seriously, I want to just give the guy a message, and then I'm off. What's so important that you're risking abandoning your regiment, Colonel? Bufang asked, and that got the boy to slump a little with some guilt. He tried to begin, but then sighed and regarded them with the eyes of a worried child who was worried about not being believed. It's a gamble, all right? I need to try and secure something. Captain Ruffin calmed down a little, though his skepticism remained. What does the Mad King have that's so important? Nothing yet. There was a weight to that cryptic answer that made Bufang frown heavily. Colonel Xing was willing to risk his own life for a trip to Omashu. He was willing to sneak past his own soldiers. Was this a whim of the spirits? The conversation went back and forth for a while, but eventually somehow the colonel got back into the boat, though this time with Bufang and the other bodyguards in tow. 2 weeks, Captain Ruffin warned. After that, spirits have mercy on you, because I'm sure none of the other captains, nor Mosey or the princess will. The small steamboat quietly left the docks after that, and the bodyguards took turns at the boat's helm after promising the colonel that they would not turn back. As the boy went back to sleep, Bufang and his fellows quietly wondered amongst themselves about his stubborn intentions for trying to meet the king of Omashu. It took them 3 days to reach the cliff edges of the Kola mountain range, and eventually come across a suitable landing site. The climb up was hard, but not as strenuous as the training drills, and by the 5th day, Omashu's peaks were sticking out in the far distance. We're going to drop off your message, Shansu confirmed instead of asked, and Colonel Xing shrugged. I'd like that as my worst-case scenario, but yeah, the first patrol we come across, I'll drop them the note and we'll leave. The spirits must have truly wanted their fun, because they did not encounter a single patrol as they climbed their way towards Omashu. Their first Earth Kingdom soldiers they encountered were the guards of the city's lone stone bridge, just a fire's throw away. With a smirk and a fake defeated shrug, Colonel Xing stepped out and announced himself to the bridge guards. Leaving Bufang, and the others hurried to follow after him. I think I have an invitation. It had been a delight to take to the field once more, despite the danger it posed to his little kingdom. Bumi understood the importance of peace and stability, but going into a fight after decades of sitting in court was refreshing. But all good things had to come to an end, and after that encounter with the prodigious firebender, Bumi had returned to his city as he had promised the boy. He'd been a good fight, way better than any bender the king had met in his long lifetime. Very polite too, bowing and observing the courtesies of battle even if he didn't have to. And the stories about the young dragon and his defiant 11th. Bumi actually got a kick out of reading through the reports for once. Despite the losses inflicted, despite the methodical applications of brutality, Bumi had to admit he liked the way the kid was thinking. His 11th Regiment were gruesome foes in combat, throwing limbs to spook their enemies and slipping into camps at night to slit throats. Many said the boy was responsible for refining, if not coming up with those tactics. Yet they were also respectable hosts to their prisoners, and had no record of terrorizing the towns and villages they came across. There were accusations of them luring the womenfolk away, but that sounded utterly tame compared to raping and pillaging that often followed in the wake of armies. Coupled with the fact that their young colonel was a terror on the battlefield by himself. No wonder the Northern Earth Kingdom states were hesitant to engage the Fire Nation Regiment, even with a significant numbers advantage. And now, said prodigy had somehow managed to show up at the gates of Omashu out of nowhere, actually taking up Bumi's invitation. Truly a shame that he had to be a Fire Nation soldier. Bumi had the boy brought in discreetly into the city and the palace, and found himself grinning as the young colonel stood before him, all formal and polite. King Bumi, I thank you for the hospitality. There was an undercurrent of something in Xing's voice, though it didn't tickle Bumi's sense of danger. Of course. Not every day I get to meet a boy who can keep up with me. Now then, how are you with spiced roasts? Bumi led the boy and his nervous bodyguards to the feast hall, and waited for them to sit down before calling in the first wave of dishes. Amusingly, the boy dug into the appetizers immediately, uncaring that his guards were not so subtly cautioning him. Xing instead gave a smirk at Bumi. I'm sure the king would have better ways of removing us if he wanted to, instead of relying on poisoning. Certainly, he replied, giving a smirk of his own. I could create a pit underneath you and seal you up. The way the bodyguards suddenly snapped their heads all around them almost made Bumi laugh. Or just drop the ceiling on us, Xing said with a shrug, and then returned to his dish. Soup's good. Lotus. Bumi almost frowned. Turtle duck, actually. Ah, I thought with how white and clear it was lotus and eggs. No way. This boy. Bumi found his lips tugging up into a grin. If you'd like, I'm sure I can have my chef serve up some lotus jelly after this. With white cream. Naturally. Yes, this kid was definitely an interesting case. His subtlety could use more work, but his guards were too nervous to notice, and everyone else was similarly on edge about the Fire Nation guests. Dinner continued with a bit of small talk, though Xing did not bring up the lack of lotus jelly appearing. The king and the colonel bantered about life away from the front lines, and anything related to the war was avoided completely. The boys' guardians eventually got comfortable enough to enjoy their meals, and Bumi noted how they remained tense and always kept Xing in their peripheral vision, ready to act in case of some subtle order or if anything happened to their colonel. Good lads, these bodyguards. Again, it was a shame they were on the enemy's side. With dinner over 2 hours later, Bumi led his stuffed guests to one of the larger guest rooms. Some casual earthbending renovated the room to comfortably house all 7 of them. Bumi was about to leave them to their food coma, but Xing stopped him. Before we retire for the night, Your Majesty, would you mind a moment of discussion? Since we'll have to leave first thing tomorrow morning after all. Of course he had another agenda for coming here. The king smiled and nodded. Of course, Colonel. I hope you don't mind if it's a discreet conversation. Xing looked to his bodyguards, and a silent staring match commenced. Chuckling, Bumi decided to chip in. With a tap of his foot, the ground underneath the guards shifted and flung them out of the room, and the doorway was closed up by a thick wall of earth. Thank you, Your Majesty. Not a problem. Now, what can old Bumi do for an interesting lad like yourself? Xing's smile dropped, and a far more serious expression formed on his face. I've come with news and a proposal. The way he voiced those words made Bumi tense just a little, and he too slipped into the same seriousness. What news? Can you guarantee no one will hear us? Another light tap of Bumi's foot thickened the walls around them, and then he nodded. Xing looked pensive for a second before he exhaled his words. The Avatar will return in a few years. The spirits told me. Before Bumi's eyes could fully widen, the boy continued. You might be familiar with him too. That sent Bumi's mind racing to figure out who exactly might that be. But before he could delve into that puzzle, or the validity of this news, the present required his attention. I see. Is there more? The boy shook his head. That's all that I am sure of, unfortunately. And you said you have a proposal? Is it to help the Avatar? Xing shook his head once more. The Avatar will likely get in the way. I have an idea about hastening the end of the war. Bumi's eyes narrowed at that. To whose favor? My regiment, the colonel answered without hesitation. My family, and the people who are tired of the long war. It was not a clear answer, but still. So what is it you propose? Xing gulped softly before he looked Bumi straight in the eyes with blazing determination. Your help as king of Omashu when the time comes for it. Help from a king? Now this sounded potentially interesting. And what exactly would you need my help with? Treachery. On both ends. And then Xing fully detailed his proposal. And Bumi found himself wondering if he should pass the mantle of mad to the boy. It was outright loony, but there was no denying that the proposal promised to be fun. There is much that is left to the mercies of the unknown future. But overall, I agree. They shook on it, the boy and the king sharing grins. A few ideas were exchanged for a bit, and then finally Bumi thinned the walls and reopened the doorway for the flustered bodyguards. I'll leave you and your men to your sleep then. Thank you for your hospitality, your majesty. Bumi couldn't hold back a chuckle. Thank you for the interesting meeting, lad. The Fire Nation colonel and his guards left the next morning, and Bumi wasted no time in preparing for the future. He'd have to reach out to old contacts and convince, or bully actually, his court to make preparations for Omashu. So immersed in the lunatic proposal that Bumi did not consider the potential return of the Avatar, and the possibility of them being a familiar face, until after the initial hectic planning was carried out. The Avatar brought boring balance after all. Xing's ambitious idea promised way more fun, even if it failed. 3 years. Almost 3 whole years had gone by without meeting Xing. After the stalling of the Omashu campaign, the 11th returned to battle and harvested a bounty of renown, favors and notoriety without a full break since. The princess used those gains and converted them into influence and prestige in the royal court, building a quiet power base for herself. Officers freed from prisoner exchanges were indebted to AZULA and her regiment, especially considering how the princess did not ask for any material compensation, only demanding that the rescued men and women fight harder. Lesser nobles were given scraps of merit by having their scions go through the rigors of the 11th's training ground and getting a letter of recommendation out of it. Generals and colonels discreetly petitioned the princess for her regiment to work alongside their children's units as a means to keep them safe in harsher phases of the war. Her father had also twice now requested for sending the 11th to fix problems that could not be dealt with by overpromising commanders. 2 stubborn holdouts had been promptly dealt with, without the messy casualties that the failed generals and their divisions had suffered. The only wounded from breaking the last mountaintop fort were several sprained ankles, in exchange for the several hundred slit throats and mutilated corpses over the course of 6 nights, and the terrified surrender of the remaining 4,000 or so garrisoned Earth Kingdom soldiers after that. Fire Lord Ozai cared not for the accusations of barbarity carried out by the 11th Regiment, and gave AZULA his explicit permission to deal with the nobles who belittled her soldiers, especially when they'd achieved such sterling results after the pathetic failures of generals and their much larger forces. AZULA was sure that her father found some inspiration in the terror tactics Xing had orchestrated. He almost smiled during dinner in the following days. Unfortunately, fixing the mistakes of incompetent and overambitious commanders was becoming a tiring chore that AZULA had to handle out of court. Many commanders took affront to the honor bestowed on the 11th Regiment, and took it upon themselves to be even more daring and reckless in their leadership, as if their pitiful results would actually change AZULA's mind enough to transfer her patronage to them. A few had dared to blatantly insinuate Xing's unworthiness, but thankfully Training Captain Run was more than happy enough to serve as champion on her colonel's behalf and handily wipe the floor with them. The captain had the grace to only lightly mangle her opponents before putting an end to each duel. After AZULA intervened and made it clear that any further insults to the regiment was an insult to her, the calls for duels stopped, and instead the princess had to deal with simpering nobles still looking down on her youth, and idiotic pissants who kept laboring behind the scenes to try diverting her favor. The The only bright side was the subtle attempts at sabotage. It gave Rin the chance to teach the officers how to deal with internal squabbles. AZULA had read the reports, and she only needed to suggest a few improvements in the way the trainees vanished unwanted troublemakers. Ren's experience in noble circles must have been quite interesting for her to be so thorough. Still, for all the small bits of fun, for all the praise she was garnering from her regiment's good work, AZULA felt a growing tingle of annoyance that she couldn't meet Xing. The battalions and even the bodyguards were put in a rotation for breaks, giving them the chance to return to the home islands, which many took at least once. All except for Xing, because the colonel made it a point to always be present when the regiment was sent to the front lines. At best, he would stop in Zilong during short resupply breaks, but otherwise would be leading the 11th across the Earth Kingdom continent in search of more glory to reap on behalf of his princess. The tactic killed off any chance of using his absence as an excuse, and the constant stream of testimonies of Xing's growing prowess and accomplishments would serve as a reminder that the young commander still had not reached his prime. Already the defiant 11th and the Scorpion Dragon leading them were becoming names to be dreaded among the Earth Kingdom armies. Recent battles had seen the mere appearance of the regiment, breaking the spirits of the enemy and turning the tide of battle. In the north and east, Xing had been personally responsible for routing armies by obliterating their command structure. AZULA had to send warnings to keep him from repeating the reckless stunts too often, but the results were still very favorable. In the south especially, the lines of the Omasha-led coalition bent and shifted to avoid her soldiers, unless there was a significant advantage in numbers. It was incredibly satisfying to hear that enemy generals would immediately call for parley, or fortified towns opening their gates immediately when they saw her regiment's banners. AZULA had learned to not only enjoy the fear, but also savor the respect of the Earth Kingdom forces. They were an honest enemy at the very least, especially when compared to the courtiers and two-faced officials in the palace. The commanders of the Southern Coalition especially were more liberal about humbly requesting for prisoner exchanges or allowances for retrieving the dead for proper burial. The damnable nobles in court sneered behind her back for repaying respect with respect, as if it weren't their own brothers and sons being freed or returned to the family crypts. Damn spineless shits. So yes, AZULA understood the need for Xing to be constantly out there, but she didn't like it at all. There was some satisfaction in exchanging letters, but she could admit to missing his voice, his smirk, pretty much all of Xing. She'd grown up enough to acknowledge that she greatly looked forward to seeing him again. Of course, she didn't admit it in the open, only to Run and Ping when the latter came back for a break. The two captains had become a pillar that AZULA found herself clinging to for support. They respected her, but never truly feared her, slowly conditioning the princess to their affections and trust. AZULA quickly saw them as the older sisters she never had, and found herself looking to their counsel more and more. That they weren't lecturing and judging like Uncle Iroh or uncompromising like father made it easy to seek the captain's opinions. Ren's and Ping's advice made it clear that they genuinely cared for her well-being, not like mother, and they were unafraid to confront AZULA's spikier side, unlike Zuko. To say that AZULA was protective of them was an understatement. She'd already exerted some quiet influence to cancel an arranged betrothal Ping very reluctantly agreed to. So to say that AZULA would not kill for her sisters, at least indirectly, would be a lie. The fat SHIT would have died soon out of health complications anyway. Captain Sungo, very reliable man, that one, merely sped up the inevitability and ensured that the useless bastard wouldn't mar Ping in any way during his short remaining existence. Zuko and Uncle would have frowned at her actions, but they were out in spirits nowhere, while Ping tearfully hugged and thanked AZULA when she inevitably found out. Suspicion was still on Run or Kai. She knew whose opinion truly mattered, which was why AZULA was comfortable enough in bearing her thoughts to Run about the coming trip. "Don't worry, AZULA," the captain offered while guiding little Fan's unsteady steps across the empty hallway. The few soldiers and staff passing by quickly hurried past them and did their best to become temporarily deaf. "I'm sure Xing is just as nervous as you, and not as good at hiding it as you are." "Are you sure?" she couldn't help ask. "It's been some years. What if he doesn't?" Ren fixed AZULA with a look of exasperation and amusement, one that was only tolerated because it was Ren giving it. The boy's spirit touched, not cabbage-brained, and we've got Ping keeping an eye on him. Xing might have to personally deal with civvies and female soldiers, but I'm pretty confident that he won't be looking at them the way he'll be looking at you. That was somewhat comforting, but still. But if Dash, the captain snorted. Azula, princess, relax. I'll bet Kai's balls that the colonel knows better than to consider other girls, even ones his age. Koshi has confirmed the burn orders are still in place, so he's still not read a single marriage proposal. And Xing might be of that age, but I bet his brain's stronger than his balls. Azula scowled at the captain's vulgar words, and then felt herself blush a bit at the sudden flashing image of Xing's bits. Of course, Rin noticed, and she waggled her eyebrows at the princess. I'll also bet it's grown along with the rest of him. Kai did say that Xing's is rather impressy. Dash. That's enough, Rin. Azula interrupted with a cough, and definitely not blushing at the thought of a very naked Xing. I heard you the first 5 times. Heh. Well, at the most, you'll have to remind our dear Xing of his loyalties to you. But he's still a colonel. Can he wait? Father and the War Council had been adamant that making Xing general would be a matter of time, not feats. Azula knew it was in part her father's way to keep the boy loyal and hardworking, while also placating the more conservative commanders. Because the moment he got promoted to general and earned the minimum nobility to go with it, Xing would undoubtedly be instantly married off to Azula. And if anyone said otherwise, she'd use them as regimental spear practice. Only the chasm between royalty and commoners provided significant scandal and uproar for Azula to actually be worried about, and the Fire Lord knew it. If he can't wait, we'll teach him how to, Rin promised, and the princess smiled gratefully at the offer. Besides, it's a perk of a royal to have a few side pieces stashed away, right? Again, Azula felt herself blushing, but she shook her head at the thought. Xing did not deserve to be a side piece. One did not relegate the best choice, the best candidate, to an auxiliary role. No, it will send the wrong message. I will have Xing as an equal. I am not going to be some vapid girl playing general and entertaining herself with little favors. Ren's smile was annoyingly bright. Well said, princess. In that case, I suppose you'll have to really remind Xing that you're worth the wait then. Sometimes, Azula wished that the captain would be as fearful and simpering like the other nobles. With the royal bodyguards joining them outside, they slowly made their way to Shu Jing's port that had been recently renovated to accommodate the traffic of recruits and vacationing soldiers. A small corvette loaned by Admiral Day to the 11th Regiment awaited the princess and the captain, with Captain Kai and his bright, friendly smile patiently awaiting them at the jetty. The big captain grinned as Ren led their daughter to him, though Azula still didn't see what exactly was adorable about the way the toddler stumbled across the jetty. Amusing? Yes. But adorable? Cute or precious? Xing had said that different people had different tastes, so maybe she didn't see any value in clumsiness, even from a toddler. Your Highness, Captain Kai greeted, managing to bow formally with Fan squealing gleefully in his arms. Azula nodded in return. Captain, it's been a few months. I'm frankly surprised that your daughter still remembers your face. Kai grinned. So am I, Your Highness. It's his size, Rin quipped. Can't find many walking hills like him to mistake them for other people. They embarked on the warship and began a trip to the capital. Azula graciously kept in the background and allowed the small family their private time, which inevitably meant she was left alone with her thoughts. She'd finally get to meet Xing soon. Spirits, why was she suddenly feeling like it's a bad idea? Despite the inner turmoil, Azula composed herself with an iron will that was honed in the quartz. By the time they approached the capital's ports, the face of a coldly aloof crown princess greeted the waiting officials. At least these were not bowing too deeply, being members of her little faction for long enough to know the line between appropriate respect and simpering. Your Highness, the lead official declared loudly, and the crowd around Azula dropped to their knees. Your loyal servants welcome you back. Loyal servants. She almost grinned at that. How much did the man mean it, truly? All right. Probably a lot, considering that she'd secured his promotion above his rivals recently, and ensured his daughter's rejection from an unfavorable, but at the time necessary, union. Seriously, what's with the recent spate of fat, unlikable nobles? Scout Captain Sungo had better have a break, soon so Azula could send him to look into that. In the present, the princess gave a slow nod and gestured for the crowd to rise. She walked with slow, purposeful steps behind the welcoming party back to the palace, with Ren further behind as protocol dictated, while Kai ran off to join his battalion. It was easy to hide the annoyance at having the people she actually trusted kept at a distance. But at least they were close enough to the little procession for their presence to be noted. AZULA paused briefly, just to turn around and glare at a minor noble who could be heard daring to advise, Rin to silence fans' squeals and giggles. The spineless woman's alabaster-white powdered face paled even further, and she backed away into the crowd, and Rin threw AZULA a grateful smile. Giving a lone nod in reply, the princess turned her attention back to the front and continued walking. The procession continued along with her as if nothing had happened, and AZULA took some heart in hearing the gurgling toddler far behind her. Fan went silent once they reached the steps of the royal palace, as if the little girl could also appreciate the sheer majesty and spectacle of the place. AZULA looked up at the end of the stairs, and unsurprisingly, her father was not there. He'd be with the other higher-ranked nobles and officials in the royal court. The Fire Lord should have no real care for a mere colonel, after all. But as the royal patron of the regiment, AZULA did have every reason to be down here, and she was glad of being able to wait, even within the limits of stifling protocols. The princess procession smoothly transitioned into a welcoming party, and they proceeded to wait. After basically 3 years of it, a little more wouldn't be anything for AZULA. She was most definitely not impatient, and there was no urge to tap her foot or just go to the other end of the street to fetch the returning colonel. Yes, AZULA knew patience, and patience sometimes sucked. The city folk were also out in force, lining the main street that the royal regiment would march through. They were out with small banners and streamers, ready to hail the much-storied soldiers of the much-respected, if not feared or loved, crown princess. The muted cheers from a distance away most definitely did not do anything to the princess' annoyed nerves. It took a bit more waiting, and the morning sun lazily beat down on her. But eventually AZULA saw him. Despite the animated crowd in the way, despite the stupid cloud of red and yellow paper confetti, at the head of the regiment was the unmistakable form of the 11th Royal Regiment's colonel. Her regiment, her colonel. Xing had grown, his armored form catching up to those of his troops. His face was obscured as ever under the mail veil of his helmet, and he was sitting confidently astride a mongoose lizard. The beast lazily ignored the fanfare around it, while its rider turned from side to side, nodding at the cheering civilians like the hero they made him out to be. AZULA was sure their eyes met several times as he made his way over. She'd felt a strange stirring each time, one that made it hard to suppress a smile. Eventually, Xing and the soldiers behind him approached the palatial gateway. He and his officers dismounted and marched on foot, the regimental banners of the royal flame and coiled scorpion following proudly behind them. The soldiers removed their helmet as they approached the stairs, and only stopped when Xing finally got within a flame breath's distance from the welcoming procession. The crash of almost 2,000 armored knees simultaneously hitting the ground properly impressed and scared the high-nosed courtiers and officials. Xing snapped up a sharp salute as he kept his head bowed. Colonel Xing of the Princess 11th Royal Regiment has returned to pay his respects and offer his gratitude. It did not take AZULA all of her might to grin or giggle. She was a master of her emotions. Really, she managed a regal nod, keeping an aloof mask as befitted her station. Welcome back, Colonel. I am glad you've returned bearing many accomplishments in my name. I am honored that your Highness approves of my work as her regiment's commander. Annoyed that he was maintaining protocol and keeping his head down, AZULA let out a silent sigh as she mustered her voice. Quite. Rise, my soldiers. Welcome home. Know that your services are greatly appreciated not only by me, but by the people of the Fire Nation. The raucous cheers gave AZULA time to relax a bit, and finally meet Xing eye to eye. He'd grown rather well over the short years, though the mischief and keen mind still shone through his gaze, allowing herself just enough of a pause before it became improper. The princess gave Xing a ghost of a smile as she nodded, and then made to turn to head up the stairs. Come, Colonel. The royal court and my father, the Fire Lord, awaits. Colonel Xing of my daughter's 11th Royal Regiment. Yes, Fire Lord. The young colonel marched out to present himself before the flame-obscured throne, easily ignoring the casual insult of tying the regiment to only the Fire Lord's daughter. Being the second in command, Mosey was the only other person from the 11th Regiment allowed in the royal court. Of course, his lowly station meant he was stuck way at the back, but even from this distance, the hall's acoustics carried the voices rather well, and he got a decent view of the goings-on. Xing was kneeling before the curtain of fire, head hung low in obeisance. There almost felt like a tangible weight from the collective stares on him. Mosey didn't need to take too close a look to sense the envy and resentment from some of the assembled military courtiers, or the more clueless equivalents from the civilian nobility. As Xing and the princess had expected, the higher-ups in the capital didn't like him too much. It wasn't all negative, though. Here and there Mosey saw the edges of admiring smirks or grateful and proud smiles, usually from familiar faces, exclusively from the military representatives. And in the back of the Great Hall, where Mosey stood, there were a bit more of Xing's supporters. Younger commanders and officers especially, or ones that the 11th had pulled out of sticky situations. The pressure lifted somewhat when the Fire Lord began to speak. Your hard work and devotion to the Fire Nation in the past few years has not gone unnoticed. You have brought victories worthy of retelling, and have salvaged the disasters from our more unwise commanders. Field commanders and colonial governors have spoken highly of your selfless, tireless work. Work that you have downplayed and refused any commendation for, even from my daughter. I only did what I had to, Fire Lord. I know that my achievements mean little on the larger scale of the long war. Mosey felt a pang of danger as Xing threw back the same words from many officials and nobles back to the court. The lieutenant colonel could hear the Fire Lord frowning in his next words. Be that as it may, under your command, my daughter's 11th Regiment has accomplished far more than any commander and force of equal standing has ever done, and with significantly lighter losses. The Fire Lord was on Xing's side. That was interesting. Your unorthodox methods, while often in direct opposition of the Fire Nation's usual doctrine, have garnered far greater, undeniable results. Unlike those who are uneducated about such matters, we appreciate the efforts the 11th Regiment has taken to secure lower losses, even in exchange for glory. Your attempt to preserve Fire Nation lives is a great credit to you, no matter what other lesser minds might think. Mosey frowned harder. For the Fire Lord to outright defend Xing like this went far beyond expectations, which meant there was a not-so-hidden ploy here. You are most gracious, Your Majesty. It was impressive how Xing could keep his calm despite the suspicious circumstances. Colonel Xing know that the royal court is most indebted to your work, and we owe you much. However, here it came. Mosey felt himself stiffen as he quite literally braced himself. We have to consider also the fact that your foes are merely Earth Kingdom rabble, and that your great victories, while outnumbered, often involve facing large conscript rabble. Mosey was truly impressed at how the Fire Lord managed to sound so patronizing, consoling, and insulting at the same time. This does not detract from your achievements, nor does it sway my personal judgment on you. However, after much counsel from my learned advisors, it pains me to inform you that I must reluctantly withhold your promotion to general, even if you are most deserving of it in my eyes. Passing the buck and washing his hands clean. That much was expected, so Mosey relaxed a little. The royal court was just trying to assuage the notoriously brutal and dreaded colonel to hopefully stop him from going on a killing spree. Xing's head bobbed a little in a shallow nod. I fully understand, Your Majesty. I am still too young, and my official service is too short to earn such a title. Even if richer nobles have bought their relatives' way into becoming a backline general, Mosey bitterly thought. Unfortunately so. However, we are not completely absent of gratitude. Colonel Xing, you are hereby raised to the new rank of First Royal Champion, and welcome to the ranks of the nobility. You will answer to me or the Crown Princess first, before any of my generals. In exchange, you will have all the rights of a noble scion, excluding the responsibilities of overseeing land. A landless noble? That was interesting. It might be a meager consolation for your deeds, but let this be a first step into the ranks of our royal court. Should you continue to excel, I will personally see to uplifting you into a rank worthy of royal attention. Mosey almost sighed with relief at hearing that. The Fire Lord was still open to the risky option of marrying Xing into the family. That was good for the regiment. Very good. Now the risk of the princess running off with the colonel, whether he wanted to or not, would drop from highly unlikely to improbable, but not unthinkable. More importantly, the Fire Lord's explicit attention would likely mean most of the negative attention would be lifted from Xing. It was a not-too-ugly compromise in the end. Xing is kept away from being a general for now, but he had been given a scrap of nobility, a promise of greater rewards. It was not the worst result any of them had expected. but not the best outcome either. A bit worse than attaining colonial governorship, but definitely better than inheriting a military fortress. Mosey would have to help his colonel pore over the details of this new rank. Though if the princess' insight into court politics remained reliable, Xing would likely spend most of his time in the colonies and the Earth Kingdom lands beyond it. Your Majesty is most generous. I will strive to be worthy of that title. A small but significant chunk of the court's time was then taken up by testimonials about Xing and the 11th's achievements, generally by those who had personally witnessed it, like Admiral De Yong and Colonel Dao, or a few that were blatantly made up and exaggerated for effect by nobles who could not have possibly have the spine to even step foot on the colonies, let alone a battlefield. Mosey guessed that it was the Fire Lord's work instead of Princess AZULA. She tended to avoid dealing with the blatantly incompetent on any level, even if it's to send a message like what her father was doing. Henceforth, the 11th Royal Regiment shall also be officially recognized as the Princess Fire Lancers, as well as holding the right to be named the Defiant Dot, and that was the final seal of royal intervention. The 11th were now officially tied to Princess AZULA, and anyone stupid enough to still petition her to rescind the patronage would be liable for directly insulting the royal family. Any idiot who now tried to argue about the regiment's priority in requisition requests and transport queues would effectively be a hindrance to royal duties. Anyone who dared call the 11th cowards or savage brutes without presenting proper evidence would really have to be careful about who heard them. It would still be only minor progress within the detached court politics, but out in the colonies, out in the ports and bases, this boon would make things far easier on the regiment. Mosey almost broke into a dumb smile at the thought of having such convenience now open to them. After all the accolades had been confirmed, Xing was dismissed and the new noble, however technical that title might turn out to be, strode towards the back of the hall, as his position warranted. Mosey greeted him with a silent smile, while the royal court continued with its proceedings. Xing was about to say something, but a movement to the side caught both their eyes. Princess AZULA was standing by the walls, her bodyguards maintaining a healthy space around her. One raised royal eyebrow was all that was needed, and Mosey followed after Xing towards her summons. As they were allowed within the cordon of bodyguards, there was no protocols to break when the two officers followed their patron out of the throne room and into a hallway, and then finally made it into a study room. "Princess," Mosey greeted with a bow as the bodyguards left the room to stand guard by the sole entrance. She gave him a nod, acknowledging his presence, though her eyes were fixed on Xing, Lieutenant Colonel Mosey. "If I might have some time with the colonel here." "Of course, Your Highness." Mosey promptly bowed and joined the bodyguards outside. No sooner did his feet leave the doorway, he heard a soft crackling of metal plates. Mosey and the bodyguards turned to see Princess AZULA's hand buried in a bent over Xing's stomach. "That's for staying away for so long," she sharply said as she stepped back. Xing straightened himself, showing no signs of discomfort from being punched in the guts other than a knowing grin. "It was an idea we both agreed to, Your Highness. Then you should have come up with a better one." The princess' hand lashed out again, but this time instead of a strike, she grabbed onto Xing's collar and yanked him towards her. Princess AZULA firmly pressed her lips against the cheek of a very surprised Xing for a couple of seconds, and then pushed the colonel back. "That's for your hard work." It was one of the very, very rare times where Mosey ever saw his young, confident colonel looking utterly confused and flustered, and his cheeks were taking on some color. He'd walked into Run and Kai, as well as other couples, or that one threesome, in the 11th before, but this was the first time Xing was actually blushing. "I thank you." Princess AZULA rolled her eyes and folded her arms. "Really? That's it?" Xing seemed to recover from that reply, and he blinked his dumb stare away. After a quick shake of his head, the colonel bowed respectfully. "I am most grateful for your concern over my well-being, Princess." He then straightened and took one long step to close the distance towards her. This time it was the princess who was caught off guard, as Xing gently wrapped his hand around hers and lifted it up. His eyes remained fixed on hers as he lightly brushed his lips against her knuckles, before slowly letting the princess' hand slip away. "Ah shit." Mosey turned to see some of the bodyguards shaking their heads at each other. A couple were pulling out pouches and offering it to their colleagues. Really thought they'd have locked lips. One of them whispered. "No way," a smug bodyguard replied. "They ain't dirty sluts like you." Before the good humor could spread, A coldness washed over them, and they returned their gaze back to the room where the princess and the colonel were staring at them. One of the bodyguards gulped. Keep watch, your highness." Then they all sidestepped away from the entrance, leaving the lieutenant colonel alone. "I'll wait for you to be done, sir." Mosey quickly broke line of sight to the young couple for safety, joining the royal bodyguards. Out of sight but still within earshot, the adults passively eavesdropped on the conversation within. "Anyway, the War Council will declare it yet, but Father has agreed to your proposal of cutting up the Earth Kingdom. The High Generals will be adopting the plans to limit Omash's reach to the south of the East Lake, while Ba Sing Se will be slowly strangled on all fronts. And the rest?" Mosey could hear the princess grin. "The War Council will approach the conquest of the weaker states on a case-by-case basis, basically leaving it up to each theater commander. Naturally, I'll assign the 11th to deal to the blessed glorious north to fully secure the colonies, and give Admiral De Jong the coastal security he needs for patrolling the Northern Sea. That's about as good as we can expect then." Indeed, there was a short, heavy pause before the princess spoke again. "Do you have news of my brother?" "We've only met the prince once more after that. He'd returned to Zilong to resupply. Of course, we did not actively aid him, but he helped himself to the stores that Quartermaster Hyung so clumsily left unlocked and unguarded. And poor Hyung had to suffer a month of forced isolation in Zilong for his mistake, basically sent to spend the time with his family. Such a tragedy. Someone told me you guided him south?" Princess AZULA's voice sounded very much amused. "And of course Xing would mirror it. That would be acting against orders, princess. He simply overheard the theories me and some others were discussing. Prince Zuko is most resourceful to be sneaking around our camp like that, and Prince Iroh was somehow able to hide an entire sack of tea leaves under his robes, the greedy bastard." "I see. Well, it's good to know the dum-dum's all right, I guess. Now, what's this I hear about a surprise?" "Oh, that." Mosey looked at the bodyguards whose attention was suddenly fixed onto him. He answered their silent question with a shrug. "Loose lips and all that. It's something I'm working on to speed things up a bit, princess. And you can't tell me about it?" "Naturally. It's a surprise after all. I just need to manage a few more noteworthy victories before I can present it to you. Not even a clue." "Well, no." A minor official shuffled quickly into the hallway, interrupting the conversation. The royal court was coming to a close, and the princess had been requested to join with the Fire Lord and his war council. "Until later then, Colonel." "Of course, your highness." Xing gave Mosey a glance, and somehow through the silence and the vague, speculative look, he got the hint. The lieutenant colonel quickly grabbed the official by his shoulders and spun him around to lead him back to the throne room. Then the bodyguards clued in to what was happening and conveniently formed up into a wall to block out the colonel and the princess from the sputtering official's line of sight. There was a rustle of cloth and metal, and as the bodyguards spread back out again, a quick glance back to a wide-eyed, slightly agape princess and a smirking Xing told Mosey all he needed to know. "I will look forward to our next meeting, my princess." Even with practically all of the 11th returning to the capital, Zilong would only suffer a slight dip in activity. The bustling colony town still had plenty of industry to keep it lively. Industry that grew from Crown Princess AZULA graciously assigning her regiment here. Under the watchful gaze of Governor Day, corruption and grifting within the royal blessed colony was kept low, to the point where the wily administrator had his lone arm controlling the inevitable black market as well. It also helped that being associated with the Crown Princess made Zilong be perceived as less as a dead-end posting and more of a potentially prestigious one, which then saw less troublemakers being dropped off the town's port, which resulted in less lazy and corrupt nobility around these parts. As a result, commerce increased dramatically in a few short years, with entire industries growing around the entertainment and well-being of the royal regiment. Zilong could proudly boast of hosting the most productive weaponsmiths and armorers in the colonies, and ranked only slightly lower than some of the famed factory towns in the home islands. It also housed a sizable guild of alchemists to meet the 11th Regiment's curiosity for new tools for the battlefield. They were the ones credited with the recent refinements to battlefield medicine, the new practice of sterilization with new antiseptics resulting in a significant drop in deaths from infection. It was an open secret that Colonel Xing, as generous as he was wise, allowed the guild to take full credit even if he was the one to guide them through the breakthroughs. In exchange, The alchemists of Zilong gladly ensured that the 11th Regiment would always have a significant amount of herbs and ingredients stockpiled and reserved for their needs. New initiates would be ensured to spend at least half their waking time grinding animal dung into powder for the regiment's naphtha weapons, for example. With the 11th being generous with their knowledge, Zilong's local garrison found itself rated highly, even among the more venerated guards of the home island. Crown Princess AZULA had even seen them fit enough to serve as auxiliary bodyguards on her rare visits, while other colonies often requested transfers or exchanges to train their own garrison up to standard. Such was the prestige he was used to that Han almost forgot how poorly the colonies were viewed as a whole back in the home islands. Almost, because the nobles and officials back in the capital were quick to remind him the moment he landed. Oh, they were all polite and smiling when they met. But that was only because the crown princess was in the same procession. But Han saw how their smiles turned hollow, how their salutes became less respectful, once their gazes swept across Zilong's representatives. The fact that Han and his staff were here on a personal invitation by the princess was irrelevant. They were from the colonies, and even a colony with royal favor was still considered a backwater. Only a pitiful few gave them the proper respect, and all of those were clearly within Princess AZULA's circle. It was obvious because of how she afforded these officials a favorable nod as she passed them, and how they didn't scrape their foreheads as they bowed in return. Han was grateful to these few officials, because otherwise there'd be no one to guide the colony representatives to their residence, or provide the servants and dragon moose to help unload the luggages and gifts. The princess chose her people carefully, it seemed, and it was just another proof of her reliable character that belied her age. Despite Crown Princess AZULA maintaining an aloof, imperious mask, the sycophants still swarmed around her, looking for scraps of her favor. It was disgusting the way they carefully flowed around her. They were like mosquito locusts smothering an armadillo bear, while the Zilong representatives and the few soldiers of the 11th Regiment that came with her were completely ignored. "Don't worry, these are minor nobles at best," an elderly magistrate suddenly said beside him in an apologetic tone. "They are an ambitious lot, but impotent. In normal circumstances, your group would be greeted by proper officials instead of parasites. But being the heir to the Fire Lord has an unfortunate effect of drawing out these lot. Be thankful that you are viewed as a nobody, or you'd have to endure their attention as the crown princess does." Han blinked, and then bowed gratefully for the advice. "Thank you, sir. I apologize if my first impression of the capital was shallow and offensive." The old man shook his head and waved a hand dismissively. No, you should feel offended. We are all working for the good of the Fire Nation after all. Princess AZULA knows that, which is why she invited you over to show her appreciation. And it is why she ensured that the attendance of me and my friends. The magistrate gestured to the princess' more honest followers waiting at the edges of the procession. Was compulsory and non-negotiable to even accidents and bad luck. It was hard for Han not to widen his eyes at the insinuation of such cutthroat politics, and the elders simply chuckled at his expression. "I take it you've never been in the capital before." "No, sir. I was born and raised in Zilong. It is by the Crown Princess' grace that I am able to set foot here for the first time." Another chuckle, and the magistrate gestured for Han to stop bowing. "Enough with the formality. I'm just a magistrate after all, and you're a governor's aide. At best, we're of equal rank." That was nonsense. Han knew how low colonial titles actually ranked by those in the home islands, and how unprestigious any colonial posting was regarded. A magistrate from the home islands, even more so the capital city, could practically overrule a colonial governor in all things with very little paperwork. Before he could spiral into that depressing line of thought, the magistrate gestured with an arm. "Come, before we lag behind too much behind the crown princess." As they walked, the old magistrate introduced himself as Shima, and apparently was rescued from obscurity along with his colleagues by Princess AZULA. For magistrates sent to Tsulai Island, Shima lamented, recalling the fallout of being on the losing end in political dealings. "We had to share the 2 villages there between ourselves. At times, we were reduced to settling arguments between the villagers about who caught the biggest fish, just to have something to file and report." That sounded horrific to Han, but the Crown Princess had noticed the gross overreach of politics in Fire Nation bureaucracy after her return from observing the 11th Regiment, and Shima and his colleagues were reassigned to more prominent posts close to the capital city. It made sense then that Shima and his friends were greatly indebted to Crown Princess AZULA, as were the small but growing number of disgraced officials and nobles she rescued. Without context, it simply looked like the princess was trying to create her own faction. But the people tied to her banner were relatively weak to offer much sway. From the sounds of it, they were all competent, but being caught in the losing side of politics left them with little true influence in higher circles, which meant the crown princess was doing this out of a sense of justice. If he hadn't been aligned to her already, Han would have been left in awe. And if not for her not-so-hidden ties with Colonel Xing, he'd have fostered some fantasies about gaining her attention somehow. The young colonel, as valiant and dutiful as he was someone Han truly did not wish to cross. Everyone in the colonies hailed the 11th Regiment as saviors and stalwart defenders, but also quietly acknowledged that they were more restrained monsters than heroes. Han had enough access to unsanitized news, mostly from the soldiers of the 11th themselves, about how the regiment conducted what they considered battle. They mutilated corpses and threw them at Earth Kingdom lines to scare the conscripts into fleeing. They had no qualms about starving the enemy into submission rather than engaging them head-on. They snuck into camps to slit throats, or in one case, leave by the Earth Kingdom officers' bedsides the heads of the very guards that were supposed to guard their tents. And all of that was under the orders of Colonel Xing. All of that was Colonel Xing playing fair. Han did not want to be the first to find out how the Scorpion Dragon handled rivals in courtship. He could settle for more pragmatic options. Thank you very much. Following the Crown Princess procession to the palace gates, Han noted how the officials and nobles began to break away from the main group. It was Magistrate Shima that enlightened him as to why. The higher ranked you are in court, the closer you get to wait by the gates. Fortunately for us, Crown Princess AZULA has made allowances for us to wait close by. Otherwise, we'd be better off waiting by the alleyways and rooftops to get a good look at her soldiers. The mildly malicious smirk the older official gave Han was rather infectious, and he found himself smirking too as he passed by the parasites that were forced to break away to wait in their specified places. The smirk threatened to break into a grin as he felt several envious glares leveled on him. By the time Han and the favored officials stopped close to the ring of bodyguards separating the princess from almost everyone else, he'd learned to savor the impotent hate and resentment directed at him. He even bothered to throw a lazy glance at a few fidgeting nobles who were unabashedly staring daggers at him. Truly, thank the spirits for the crown princess and her magnanimity. The soldiers of the 11th appeared moments later, marching as one under the raucous cheers of the capital's residents lining the streets. Colonel Xing was at the lead, a picture of silent confidence even with his helmet masking his expression. Han bowed deeply as the colonel's attention briefly rested on him. Uncle Day had hammered into him the great debt Zilong will forever owe the 11th Regiment. So paying formal, grateful respect was the least he could offer to the young colonel that had kept Han's uncle from losing anything more than his arm, as well as preserving his governorship. Surprisingly, a glance to the side showed several of the princess officials bowing just as deeply as Han. Some of my colleagues owe the colonel as much as they owe the crown princess, Shima had said later. Once the princess and the colonel moved into the throne room to join the royal court, and the procession was effectively disbanded. A few were once allies of the colonel's predecessor, Li Dai. It is no secret that Colonel Xing had petitioned the crown princess to look into lifting those unfortunates out of the pits of obscurity and put their talents to appropriate use. They might not have the wealth and influence they once did, but at least now they're not counting turtle ducks or overseeing uninhabited islands. The disgust must have shown, because Shima chuckled at Han. Let this be your first lesson then, Aide Han. Merits will take you far in most places in the Fire Nation. But merits alone will not be enough once you earn a foothold in the capital. It is not enough to be great by yourself. You need equally great friends and allies as well to rise here. The wider the network, the better. Shima and several of his colleagues then led Han and his small team to their quarters while they awaited the princess to summon them. In the meantime, Han took the opportunity to socialize with the friendly officials and nobles who were aligned with Crown Princess AZULA. They were all hospitable, and the small group quickly welcomed the colonial governor's aide into their ranks. They freely answered many of Han's questions and provided him useful pointers in navigating the capital's political labyrinth. Despite Han's pessimism, it turned out there were actual friends to be made in the home islands. By the time the Crown Princess summoned him, Han had a clearer picture of the limits and possibilities of his goals here. I trust you were not too bored during my absence, advisor? Han bowed deeply before the crown princess. None at all, your highness. Magistrate Shima and several others were generous with their company. Good. That's good, Princess AZULA said as she nodded with some satisfaction. Now then, before I leave you to your vacation, I have a quick task for you. As you command, your highness. Han kept his head bowed as the crown princess produced a small sheet of paper and offered it to him. Here is a list of names. Disgraced officials, and a few ostracized nobles. Seek them out, and convince them to move to Zilong. The princess sniffed with a hint of displeasure. I'd see them myself, but it's supposedly improper. No surprise why. Having a royal all, but forcing you to leave to the colonies would be seen as a banishment or exile by everyone, the recipient included. Princess AZULA wanted them to migrate in relatively good terms, which meant having to use an appropriate secondary like himself. I don't expect all of them to accept your offer, but do try your best. Despite their pathetic states, these are all able administrators and overseers. Their only real crime was being on the losing end of court politics. If the crown princess thought they were useful, then having them in Zilong would definitely be a boon. Having more officials would allow the town to further expand its administrative reach. It might even make it possible to achieve the status of a colonial city. I'll see it done, your highness. The princess grinned. I'm sure you don't need the motivation, but I've spoken to the colonial ministry. If Zilong can continue to sustain its prosperity and growth, your uncle Governor Day might see himself being promoted to colonial overseer for his excellent work. And that'd leave his governorship open for his competent aide, which, if I recall, is you. Han immediately bowed deeply, not trusting himself to hide his own wide grin at the tantalizing promise she had offered him. Uncle Day being a colonial overseer would be a milestone for not only his family, but the colonies as a whole. It'd mean one of their own would have a major role in setting taxes and quotas, as well as being a voice, a representative for all of them. Having Uncle Day as a colonial overseer was great enough, but having Han fill in the post of governor in his stead. Your highness is most gracious. I know, she replied lightly. Chi Song had to remind himself to remain alert as he followed Princess AZULA into the home base of the 11th Regiment. They might be good friends, but he had an image as a royal bodyguard to consider. Plus, he'd already been written up once by the damned head office about his lackadaisical attitude. Though it was a small consolation that Chi Song was not the only one. Practically everyone who was tasked to watch the crown princess had a write-up, or at least an informal telling off, exclusively because of their relaxed conduct when in the midst of the princess pet psychopaths. The soldiers of the 11th were brutal fighters, but also steadfast friends to Chi Song and his colleagues, and in the cases of several officers, utterly loyal friends to the crown princess. The other royal bodyguards guarding the Fire Lord didn't know just how safe the royal daughter was in the midst of her troops, but then they'd never seen how both parties had interacted. Princess AZULA had grown along with her regiment, allowing herself to change to fit into the sanctioned murderers that welcomed her almost as family. The other bodyguards had confirmed that she definitely tempered herself, losing most of her casual sadism and pettiness while gaining a different flavor of self-confidence. Among the soldiers, she was more relaxed and far less prickly, to the point where she endured the bumbling of her palace tutors rather than cycle them through exile and punishments. Bettering yourself is good, Chi Song had overheard Captain Ping counsel her, but if you throw everything else away to be the best, or what you think is the best of what goal you're seeking, then you'll be nothing but a lifeless tool. What applies to Xing also applies to you, AZULA, Captain Ren had added. You're a princess meant to rule over the Fire Nation, not lead the front lines. Frankly, if you have to worry about dealing with putting down unruly nobles and generals through duels so often, then maybe it's because you've focused on the wrong things. Before this, their advice would have warranted banishment or worse. But the months with the regiment made Princess AZULA seriously consider the words. Not only that, but the two captains were the only ones who were able to actually refer to the crown princess simply as AZULA. An unsuspecting court noble had once tried to berate them for their lack of decorum. But Princess AZULA's glare quickly silenced her, and only through the mercy of both captains did the poor woman retain her position in court, and probably her life, judging from the sheer fury in the princess' gaze. That same fury was directed to anyone who dared get in the way of her regiment's growth. Princess AZULA reluctantly tolerated delays due to weather, supply shortages, or even sickness. But spirits save any who dare try to swindle or bend the rules with her. 2 officials from the colonial ministry had already been removed from their posts after trying to make excuses for the unwarranted delays in supplying the colonial barracks with its shipment of weapons and armor. The scouts of the 11th had been sent to quietly investigate and found the shipments sold piecemeal to various forces throughout the colonies. Princess AZULA had sent out letters requesting the return of the supplies from governors and generals, and to their credit, every piece of equipment was accounted for within a month's time. The princess graciously reimbursed the buyers, with the corrupt officials' wealth of course, and no further face was lost. The Fire Lord had been impressed and mildly disapproving when he heard of the whole thing. He liked how the princess wielded her fear and authority, but he'd have preferred the officials responsible be literally fired. With that kind of a reputation built around herself, it was hard for Chi-Song not to feel a bit safer when he entered the compound of the 11th Regiment's base before the sun rose. They were likely as protective of her as he was, maybe even more so for the officers who viewed her as a younger but highly talented sister. Most soldiers took the time to stop and bow as the royal group walked past them, though a few managed respectful nods instead as they hurried past to handle some task or another. The crown princess was lenient with the latter, and everyone knew if there was an entourage trailing behind her, these rushing soldiers would stop to pay their full respects. Princess AZULA marched with purpose towards the private quarters of the regiment's colonel, probably for the first time since the base had been built. Up until now, it was empty thanks to how busy Colonel Xing kept himself in the front lines. They reached the door, and the princess gave sharp knocks on the door, almost treating it like a practice dummy with how much force she was using. When the door finally opened, the tenseness that surrounded the princess throughout the morning vanished. Chi-Song also forcefully ignored the peripheral view of her face from his position behind her right flank. It was safer not to acknowledge the fact that his charge's cheeks bloomed with faint redness as the young colonel appeared, dressed in a plain sleeping robe. Colonel Xing's sleepy eyes immediately snapped to focus, and he straightened to attention. "Your Highness," he greeted with a casual bow and salute. "Xing," the crown princess returned with a stiff nod. Chi-Song did not waste his time or risk his life wondering whether her eyes actually rested on the colonel's body for a bit longer than necessary. "You're up late." "Because I was up late, princess." At her head tilting to one side, the commander shrugged. "Working on your plan to secure the colonies." Princess AZULA smirked at that, still finding it amusing that she was taking credit for an idea the colonel had brought to her attention in their letters. Chi-Song knew, because he heard her discussing it with Captain Run and some of the generals in court, including a few high generals in the War Council. The bodyguard also knew that she'd have preferred letting Colonel Xing take the credit for a chance of more recognition, if not for the fact that the plan would face more resistance if that were the case. "It's not too great a challenge, I hope? Just down to the what-ifs. The main details have been triple-checked and given over to the new officers to review and poke holes in." "Good. I have secured the services of General Shou and Colonels Dao, Koda, Yashin, and Hua. You have your army, Xing." "More like you have your army, princess." The crown princess rolled her eyes. "Semantics. With the new army's core confirmed, we will see how many more will flock to this unglamorous task. If we can gain even half of the names you've highlighted, the campaign would be done in a year's time. 2 at most." There was a huff before Princess AZULA folded her arms. "Do you have such low expectations from me?" "No, Your Highness," the colonel replied with a shake of his head. "Just low expectations from everyone else. Perhaps. But don't forget, it is my name that will be attached to this operation. As unglamorous as it might be, there will still be many who will seek out a chance at earning royal favor." "Of course, Your Highness. Now, make yourself presentable. You owe me a sparring match for the years you've been gone, and for the other day." Chi-Song purged the thought that a blushing princess might be cute, so that he didn't accidentally sign his death warrant by blurting it out at the wrong time. The regimental home base was quiet, but it was not because the sun was still rising. The recruits here would usually be in the middle of endurance drills by now, or finishing up their night training. And neither did the 11th being given leave as a whole contribute to the heavy silence, as many of the soldiers would only head back to their homes in a few days' time, once the captains had finished transferring recent knowledge to the instructors to further refine the curriculum. Instead, It was AZULA's presence that kept everyone still. Her and Xing, standing across from her in the sparring grounds. She didn't mind the silent stares of the soldiers ringing the grounds on the two of them. She didn't care that her bodyguards were tense with worry. The princess' attention was fixed on Xing. It helped that he was lightly dressed. AZULA rather liked how his toned muscles shift subtly as he adopted a faux casual stance, his hands behind his back. She liked his smile that was now free of the intimidating, to the weaklings, helmets of the regiment. She liked how his eyes hinted at how serious he was taking this spar despite the false complacency he displayed. Firebenders ready. That was not the call to start the fight, merely the sign to get the firebending soldiers around them to prepare to intercept any stray shots. AZULA grinned. This was going to be fun. And begin. At Ren's mark, AZULA propelled herself forwards with the aid of fiery bursts from her feet. Xing merely leaned back and twisted out of the way, letting her fist pass just inches away from his face. She was going too fast to properly redirect her strike, so AZULA lashed out with her legs instead. Xing, the cocky bastard, took 4 steps back to avoid the wave of fire hurled from her feet. AZULA landed in a roll, sending out bolts of fire with hands and feet as she did so to maintain distance from her opponent. The princess needn't have bothered, as Xing was content to remain in place, only twisting out of the way of the projectiles. "Your new stance might annoy me," she remarked before launching herself at him again. It took 2 long strides to close the distance, and AZULA exploded in a flurry of punches and kicks, trying to box her smirking opponent in. Xing sidestepped and dodged, but eventually a low kick followed by a jab to the ribs forced him to finally release his hands from his back to slap away her strike. "Gotcha," AZULA hissed, grinning hard. Xing let out a short chuckle before he retaliated, and it was the princess' turn to be put on the defensive. He struck quickly, almost as fast as the scorpion that he adopted as his emblem. AZULA found herself backpedaling as deflecting and twisting away from the fists and knife hands were insufficient to keep her untouched. Despite the shifting balance of the fight, AZULA was grinning from the exhilaration of such a fight. Try as they might, the captains still held back out of her position, and the vapid fools in court that dared take up her offer were not even worth the satisfaction of victory. Xing was only restraining his abilities so that he did not outright kill her with a blast of white fire, but otherwise his strikes carried the intent to actually hurt. And yet there were people who dared say he would not know how to appease a royal princess. Idiots. AZULA leant in to slip through a strike, and sent her knee shooting up into Xing's exposed stomach. She realized the trap too late, but managed to turn the rising knee into a swift kick that pushed both of them back before his elbow came down on her neck. As they resetted their stances, the princess found herself grinning harder. The feel of Xing's skin still lingered pleasantly on the sole of her feet. It was hard and warm, and there was an urge to try getting an open palm on him somehow. AZULA crushed that stray thought and focused on the fight. She was determined to at least try and win this fight. Deciding that another brawl would not favor her, AZULA dropped into a traditional sleeping dragon stance. As expected, Xing rushed at her to stop her from fire bending. She quickly flowed into a combat stance of the 11th, and her hands quickly snapped out into a punch. The sounds of awe from the soldiers around her sent a thrill running up her spine as blue bolts of fire forced Xing to sidestep and only almost, stumble. With his charge slowed, AZULA channeled her chi into her hands to conjure 3 short blades of blue fire between her closed fingers on each hand, as if she were suddenly wielding throwing knives. She fully broke Xing's charge by hurling the daggers, sending 6 bolts of azure flame that forced him to leap aside, and then back. "Oh, well done, princess." The praise, while snarky in its delivery, was genuine. Xing wouldn't be grinning like that if it wasn't. AZULA knew him well enough, even with the 3 years apart. "Thanks," she replied smugly, letting a ball of blue fire dance in an open hand. "It was something I developed by myself. No doubt about it. Otherwise, whoever taught you such a technique would not shut up about it. I'm glad you approve. It doesn't hurt if the princess who leads us proves herself to be extraordinary in her abilities. Your attempts at flattery have been noted, and AZULA will never admit how much she enjoyed it. Not in public, anyway. Now, we're in the middle of a fight. Of course, your highness. Let me end this, so I can continue singing your praises." He leant back, and with a quick downward slash blasted apart the ground between them in a huge wave of white fire. AZULA flinched at the blinding light, and the wall of heat slamming into her, but still sent jets of blue fire into the fading explosion. She had misjudged Xing. Instead of diving through the cloud of smoke and dust as she'd expected, AZULA glimpsed up to find the boy diving downwards, head and fists first, from the air. She quickly punched out more bolts of fire, though the hasty attacks were quickly batted aside. AZULA was forced to jump away when Xing let out a torrent of blinding fire, but the blast wave knocked her off balance and caused her feet to trip over one another. She was falling backwards, but the fall was arrested when strong hands reached out to grab her wrists and pull her back up. The force of it almost sent AZULA tripping straight into Xing, and she barely stopped herself from smashing her head into his. As it was, her was barely a handspan away from his smirking features, and for some reason that knowledge froze AZULA up. "Careful there, Your Highness," he said lightly. "Wouldn't want you to dirty yourself too much." Xing's smirk flashed into something more mischievous for the briefest of moments as he added two words that only she could hear. "My princess." AZULA stiffened and snapped out of the trance. The urges to press her face against Xing banished at the heavy insinuation of his two words. "My princess," he'd said. Again, Xing had declared his possession of her. He'd staked his claim, even if only in private. AZULA found fighting back the giddy urge to grin or smile, or just jump onto Xing, and instead backed away and offered a salute to end the fight. Well done, Colonel. You prove yourself worthy of my attention once again, and I am grateful as ever for it. Your Highness, you should have used my princess again." AZULA really wanted to hear him say that again. "Quite. Now come, my Colonel. We've some matters to discuss." "As you command." She stiffened for the briefest of moments, and felt a wash of relief and satisfaction when he added in a whisper, "My princess." She could get used to the pleasant tingle from hearing that very quickly. But right now, the princess had to pointedly ignore the stupid grins on Ren's and Ping's faces. At least the men were smart enough to pretend nothing had happened. "Belated congratulations on your promotion, General." "Thank you, Xing." Shou returned the bow and salute with ones of his own, though his smile was one that was more of amusement than thanks. The general wasn't that oblivious that he couldn't trace the tangled trail to the source of his promotion. With how convoluted it was, thanking the crown princess openly was probably not a good idea. So Shou settled for bowing deeply at her favored commander instead. Bright as ever, Xing took the hint and gave a small smirk. "Her Highness, Crown Princess AZULA, has assigned me under your command for this operation. I am at your disposal, General." Shou couldn't help grinning at that. "I look forward to seeing you terrorize the battlefield, Colonel." With Xing's inclusion into this little band, all doubts about coincidences and hidden schemes were banished. The supposedly thankless task of taking the Northern Earth Kingdom states was just a veil to hide Xing's or the princess agenda. There was no way Shou would have command of his close friends otherwise. Yashin had been dragged all the way from the east, and Dao and Kota from the south. With Xing now here, there was no chance at all that this was some bureaucratic coincidence. It also confirmed the moves that the princess had been making. Unlike the battle-glutton Dao or uninterested Yashin, Shou always kept an eye on court politics. He'd seen the quiet migration of Li Dai's friends and allies from the forgotten corners of the Fire Nation to the colonies, often with subtle promotions to go along with it. Administrators of isolated islands and minor officials stuck in useless offices became magistrates and junior administrators. Whole families were uprooted to move east, often in careful stages. To those in the royal court, it seemed as if favors were being wasted to recruit the exiled and the disgraced. The recruitment had not been indiscriminate, and it took Shou some digging to find the pattern in it. Through the intermediaries of her intermediaries, Crown Princess AZULA had been plucking out only those disgraced courtiers and officials that were proven to be talented first. Then those with fewer reported merits but latent potential were taken. In order of potential, Shou assumed. Officials and nobles who had a history of greed and corruption were often not included, save for those who had skirted Fire Nation laws and red tape to meaningfully improve their duties. The princess was keen to offer second chances, but there was a minimum entry requirement, it seems. Within the military, though, her hand was far more subtle, preferring to nudge rather than demand for her preferred assignments or stratagems. Other than her involvement in promoting Shou, the only sign of her intervention was the increased efficiency in logistics across the board for armies stuck in the front lines, or cutting short armada patrols to ensure that no fleet should have to operate beyond their assigned time frame. Colonel Wa's addition to the core of the army was one thing Shou could not figure out, other than having a dim view of Dao, which was very much deserved in Shou's opinion. The stoic commander was very much an unknown quantity. She'd reported to him without any sign of resentment or bootlicking, and showed only some satisfaction when the princess' involvement in this northern campaign was revealed. Perhaps it was simply due to the recognition of her battlefield merits. The princess had a thing for gathering hidden talent after all. Maybe almost sterilizing Dao was considered a worthy feat? Regardless, Colonel Wa had been handpicked along with Shou and his friends, so she would share equal involvement and acclaim in this campaign. To do otherwise would be an insult to the princess who nominated her, and possibly the young colonel that might have made the suggestion in the first place. Shou gestured to said young colonel to offer him a seat. "I suppose you would have a better idea than me of the princess' intentions," he ventured. Xing glanced around the austere office, particularly out the 2 windows, before he sat down. Her Highness wishes to tidy up the borders of the colonies, which would hopefully lessen the burden of defending against incursions. The boy shrugged casually. It would be the first step in allowing the colonies to develop peacefully. Shou couldn't help pry to peek between the lines. That's all. Well, subjugating the Earth Kingdom realms, there would give the Fire Nation access to safer ports to patrol the Northern Sea, which would also conveniently serve as a staging point if ever they needed to attack the Northern Water Tribe. Other than that, Xing shrugged again. Princess AZULA is taking her job as heir very seriously, I suppose. After the dark whispers of the former Crown Prince's banishment, Shou could see why. The princess might have felt like she needed to prove herself to her father that she was capable of ruling, even if she was still too young to be so involved like this. It was a shame that the Fire Lord had such a temper on him, but it was not Shou's place or rank to judge. Perhaps Prince Zuko would be forgiven after a couple more years and allowed to pay a different, less impossible sort of penance. Then I'll strive to not let this Northern Pacification Army be a disappointment. The plans she suggested to the War Council should not be too hard to carry out with our current force. Xing gave a knowing grin. Despite her youth, the princess has a talent for strategies and tactics, he said blandly, not matching his expression at all. I'm sure her tutors would be proud of her accomplishments. From what I heard, she surpassed most of them, the colonel quipped, and Shou almost broke into a chuckle. Most, because it was clear to those that bothered digging that she hadn't yet beaten Xing in a spar. No doubt he was also responsible for mentoring her on the various subjects of war. Xing let out a cough to change the topic. If I may ask, General, what is the status of the army? Shou nodded, feeling far more comfortable about discussing more mundane matters. There are several more commanders who have pledged their forces to this army. Some are in the middle of mustering, while the others will join us in the colonies. Any notable names? The boy asked with a raised eyebrow, and the general shook his head. I've accepted the assignment of reliable, steady colonels and captains. Their fame might be limited, but they can be depended upon. This is not a campaign for the famous, after all, not unless they're trying to earn the princess' favor. And pity the fools who try that. As royal champion, Xing now had the right to call out nobles and officers of any rank, especially if they presumed too much about what the royal family wanted or needed. But it was too late for that anyway. Shou had immediately sought out the less picky commanders when he got the assignment, back before Princess AZULA attached her name and support to the subjugation campaign. He had little stomach for glory hounds and parasites after Shirluo. Speaking of favor, Shou said, digressing from business for just a bit with a placid smile. What's this I hear of you making the princess blush, Xing? The way Xing fidgeted was highly satisfying. It was good to see him act his age. I hope you didn't apply kodas, lessons in approaching girls? Or spirits forbid Dao's? On some thought, Xing couldn't possibly have taken Dao's advice. He'd be a eunuch otherwise. This almost feels like old times, Yashin remarked with a casual smile as he raised his tea bowl in the air. His old friends mirrored the action, and they clinked their bowls together before sipping the rice wine-laced tea. Ah, that hits the spot, Koda exhaled as he leaned into his seat. All praise to the Crown Princess for allowing us to fight alongside each other again. Yashin chuckled and reached for the teapot for a refill. I'll drink to that. Me tea dash. Dao let out a belch that quite possibly shook the wooden walls of Yashin's study room, and had the decency to look somewhat ashamed. My bad. Anyway, good health and good cheer to the princess. And the Fire Lord, of course, Kota drawled. Of course, the other two colonels agreed, and they clinked their bowls again. Yashin made a show of remembering someone else as he downed his beverage, and then reached for the teapot again. I can't forget our young Xing too. Yes, indeed, Kota agreed, his head bobbing sagely as he extended his empty bowl to Yashin. Thank the spirits for the boy. Li Dai would be proud of what he's done for himself so far. Left unsaid was Xing's definite involvement in getting the band together again. As the boy once said, "Here, here, and the kids with us as well. We'll definitely have some good fights to look forward to." Yashin and Kota exchanged smirks before glancing at their boisterous colleague. Of course the fighting's all you care about, Dao. The loud colonel gave a toothy grin. Well, there's no soft company in the front lines. None that you've not chased away, Kota added with a laugh, and with good humor, Dao joined in as well. Hopefully, Dao wouldn't get lucky out there, or they'd have to palm off the task of calming Lady Dao to poor Xing again, or settle for trussing Dao and somehow tossing him into enemy lines, so that his wife would tear through the enemy to reach and finally castrate her philandering husband. Truly, how the old colonel was able to keep his balls after such a long and lax marriage was a marvel to Yashin. The trio continued to enjoy their little reunion with laughter and reminiscing. Eventually, the topic shifted to more current topics. So it's true that young Xing bested the Mad King? Dao's half-drunk eyes locked onto Kota with sudden seriousness, and his head bobbed up and down a little too loosely. Heard it from the troops who tagged along with Xing's. The boy ran into the king of Omashu. There was a big fight, and Bumi left the field. Tell me how Xing lost that fight. Point. Kota conceded with a shallow bow. A shame for his age, the thinner colonel sighed. It'd be interesting to see how far Xing might go as a general. Yashin smiled at that sentiment. Young Xing definitely had the talent, and such a promotion would do much honor to Li Dai's memory. Yes, fortunately with his accomplishments, it's only a matter of a few years. Unlike us old-timers stuck where we are. Hey now, Dao interrupted, a little affronted. It's not all that bad for us. Shou got to general, didn't he? Both Yashin and Kota leveled him a look. Yes, Dao. The youngest among us, the talented one who studied under Li Dai, got promoted to general. What's that say about us? After a few seconds of pondering Yashin's question, Dao let out a heavy sigh. We're in deep shit. The other two nodded with faux sageness. Quite so. You're too loud and reckless. Kota doesn't like having to decide everything, and I can't stand the shoulder rubbing. Well, Colonel's not so bad, Dao consoled. But you're right, Xing just needs a few years. Then he can get to smashing the PRI dash. The colonel of the 4th Regiment aborted his sentence as he received cold glares from his friends. Dao, Yashin began, if you're going to say what I think you're going to say, I suggest you do it outside my estate, so I don't get dragged along when the royal guard comes for you. Kota snorted. And say it a little louder, so the palace can hear it straight from your mouth. The flustered commander huffed. I wasn't trying dash, no you're not, Kota agreed. With you, you skip the trying part and go straight to offending. How you manage to have children with the way you antagonize women is truly a mystery. Bah, as if you've got any right to talk, ass-kisser. Dao deflected, and the colonel of the 31st Cavalry Regiment raised a finger. Sodomizer, actually. But it's not about me now, is it? Please, Yashin interrupted before things escalated. He didn't want to renovate his home again. Back to the topic of our young friend. As his friends cooled down, he smiled and brought them back to the matter at hand. Anyway, any news regarding the Northern Pacification Army? He'd been late to the capital, so Yashin had little time to be dragged into court politics. Oh, plenty, Dao huffed, his face suddenly flashing red with anger. Got a few damn nobles asking me to join their little petition to request for the 11th's relegation. The tea in the colonel's hand began to visibly steam and bubble. The royal champion is too young to take such a prominent role, Dao mimicked in a high, mocking voice, and then snorted with derision. Damn idiots still haven't gotten it in their heads that the boy's above their petty tactics. It's in the name. Royal. Champion. That's about the same here, Kota admitted with an irritated frown. There's insinuations of Xing being too young to be part of the army's corps. The smarter ones just ask for him and his regiment to act as a reserve for show, to allow Xing a better opportunity to learn proper soldiering from the besteemed and hard-working general who worked his way to his rank. Even Yashin had to sneer at that. Why some felt the need to stall Xing's rise was a puzzling mystery to him. But then again, such was the power plays of the capital city. The goal always seemed to be dragging everyone else down, so that you could step on their heads to rise up. Once more, it was Dao that took the loudest offense. Bah! As if any of those slickers know anything about soldiering. It was a sentiment that Yashin could toast to, so he did. Dao gulped his bowl of tea and let out a hearty burp. They just want our boy to keep grinding away uselessly, so he doesn't keep making fools out of them. Keep him stuck doing nothing like what happened to Li Dai. Unfortunately, it was probably an accurate assessment. Good thing the princess knows to keep Xing clear of them. Of course she would. The girl's smart after all. Yashin winced at the informal address of the crown princess, while Koda just sighed with the resignation of a man about to be executed. Dao didn't notice or care, and went on. She'll make sure Xing gets the glory he deserves. Then maybe Yashin stopped him before he got everyone in trouble again. Dao, no. We know, so you don't have to say it. They were all rooting for Xing to do well, and that included the chance at happiness with the crown princess. Bah! Dao thankfully conceded the point and sagged in his seat to grumble. Stupid court fools who've barely seen the front, let alone fight in it, and they think they know soldiering. He loudly gulped down another bowl of tea before finishing his tirade. Impressing the princess, earning the respect of the Mad King, getting victories that officially impressed the Fire Lord? Now that's soldiering. See any of them even do a fraction of that. Yashin had to go out to call for another batch of wine and tea. It'd be a shame to not toast vehemently to that. There was no fanfare in Zilong this time to welcome the soldiers. Instead, the town's main roads were kept clear to allow for the regiments of the Northern Pacification Army to march through unimpeded. General Shou led the way with his 16th Regiment, taking a straight route out of the colony to head north. Interestingly, Colonel Hua found her 51st Grand Company trailing right after them. She'd expected the other groups to go after the general's command. They were all better acquainted with him after all. But instead, her Grand Company had taken the next highest place of honor. Perhaps the general was trying to reassure her? If so, Hua appreciated the gesture. She was well above it, but being the odd one out in a core group of otherwise familiar friends made for some awkwardness in the main command tent. Why the crown princess saw fit to pick her for this army was beyond Hua, but the colonel was grateful for it, and she was even more grateful that the general had kept the blabbering Dao at the rearmost position. Almost rearmost position, anyway. Honor and courtesy demanded that Dao's 4th Regiment be ahead of the regiments and companies that attached themselves to the army after the crown princess involvement was made public. It would be unseemly if the core groups, the ones picked by the cunning princess herself, were relegated to the back of the line. The army of about 30,000 soldiers, discounting camp followers and supply staff, moved in surprisingly good order and speed, with the 11th Royal Regiment serving as a whole as scouts. Rather interestingly, the Crown Princess soldiers were always sent ahead of the army. General Shou fully trusted their abilities, as did Dao, Yashin, Koda, and even a few of the other commanders. Hua had to admit feeling rather impressed with the colonel of the defiant 11th. Young Xing was far more intelligent and cunning than his detractors whispered. And he was humble too, never once giving any airs about his rank as a royal champion. He only voiced his thoughts when the general or the other commanders asked him about it, and had so far never made any requests for his regiment's placement. It would be easy to mistake his humbleness for meekness, but Hua was not fooled. The boy had fended off King Bumi, after all. She'd heard the excited chatter of the soldiers firsthand, and there was no way such awe could be falsified. And any doubts about young Xing's abilities were quickly dispelled when messengers from the 11th brought back news of an Earth Kingdom army moving to intercept them barely 2 weeks after leaving Zilong. It was a smaller force than the Northern Pacification Army, which suggested that there might be other groups on the way to support them. Colonel Xing requests permission for the 11th to engage them, the soldier reported, and General Shou grinned as he nodded. Tell him to leave some for us. They're going to engage the enemy force? Hua had asked, speaking for the other stunned colonels and captains. The enemy army had been reported to be a small force, but still, it was just one regiment against several thousand soldiers. Is that wise? The general nodded with some amusement. Don't worry, I trust Xing to be a good sport and leave us a satisfactory piece of the fighting. He's just going to tie them down. Any words she wanted to sputter in protest were interrupted when the blowhard Dao opened his mouth. Ah, calm your tits, Hua. The boy's been bleeding the Earth Kingdom for a while now. Hua strode up to her chuckling colleague and feigned a kick between his legs, which he dodged as she expected, allowing her to redirect the momentum into a powerful downward strike that decked Dao across the face and knocked him down on all fours. "You're a colonel and a nobleman," she spat angrily. "Act like it." While the other commanders stared in horrified silence, General Shou and Colonels Yashin and Koda were grinning and chuckling. "Well said," the general offered, and then glanced at his friends. "8 from me." Hua blinked confusedly at that. "Sounds right. 8 as well," Yashin replied with a nod. 7, Koda added casually. "What? Your score?" the colonel of the 31st Cavalry blandly remarked. "Would have been a solid 8 or even a 9 if you used an uppercut instead." I'd have preferred a low blow myself," General Shou commented as Koda yanked Dao up. "Anyway, make ready your forces, commanders. If we move quickly enough, there'll still be an enemy to fight." It took the better part of 2 hours before they came across fleeing Earth Kingdom peasants, many covered in soot and smelling of shit. Hua had her troops double-time it to the sounds of fighting, only to find a battlefield covered in thick smoke and broken earth, and littered with bodies. She didn't find the banners of the 11th, but the enemy army seemed disorganized, and were looking the other way with their backs generally exposed to her. Not questioning the opportunity given to her, Hua quickly ordered her ranks to tighten up and prepare for a wedge charge. Beside and behind her, the other commanders were adopting similar orders with their regiments and companies. The Earth Kingdom army did not react in time to the flanking charge. A storm of fire swept away the surprised soldiers, and Earthbenders were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the initial barrage. Hua herself dove into the fray with her flames channeled to her sword. She ignored the conscript chaff and seared a path towards officers, cutting many of them down as they tried desperately to restore order to their ranks. Hua kept a stony, grim expression as she dueled and bested her enemies, the cold battle trance that settled on her lending Hua clarity to her senses. She ignored the battle roars of her allies, or the fearful cries of her enemies. At the back of her head, Hua made note of the flow of battle around her, and she had short moments of awareness to bark out orders. Other than that, Hua enjoyed the meditative violence of combat. Any who stood in her path were cut down in short order, by flame or by blade. The colonel cut and stabbed and burnt anything that wasn't Fire Nation, and her final blow was against something that tried to pounce at her from behind. "Whoa, easy there, colonel. It's me, Spirit Sake. The battle's over." Hua snapped out of the battle trance, and she extinguished the flames on her sword as she withdrew it from the bind with Dao's axes. "I know," she said with a snort, absently flicking the ash and soot off her weapon before sheathing it. "A shame you had to block." Taking a glance around, the colonel realized the shattered enemy around her fleeing or surrendering. Finally, she saw the banners of the 11th, waving on the other end of the field. Seemingly picking up on her unasked question, Colonel Koda appeared out of nowhere. "I got a month's wage that Xing pretended to be a larger army to draw the enemy's attention away from us." Hua gave him an incredulous look. What if we didn't reach in time to support him? To pull off such a ploy with just one regiment against a whole army was almost Dao levels of stupidly risky. Her colleague shrugged a bit too easily, tugging at his thin beard. He'd have pulled back and kept them running in circles. "Won't be the first time." Such casual faith in Koda's voice made Hua regard the banners of the Princess Fire Lancers with undenied awe. "Oh," the colonel suddenly said. 8 for getting Dao to block with both axes. "If you tripped the oaf, it'd be a full 10. Zuko forced himself to steely calmness. It was his fault that the Avatar escaped. He was man enough to admit it. He should have remembered that a young face did not necessarily mean an easy challenge. Xing was proof of this. At least none of the crew suffered any serious wounds. The worst damage any of them suffered were bruises to their warrior's pride, being bested by inexperienced children. Zuko looked at the massive pile of ice and snow that half-buried his ship, and then turned to the skies where his prey had escaped to before sighing. "All hands on deck. The sooner we clear ourselves away from this glacier, the sooner we can continue the hunt. That means my uncle as well. Send someone to wake him." "Should we return to the village?" a soldier asked, referring to the collection of fur-skin huts that the Water Tribe called a settlement. "No," Zuko answered without hesitation. The Avatar had escaped us, but there was no grave dishonor from his actions, even if he had help from the tribe, and the prince remembered Xing's dislike of punishing innocent civilians. Besides, we have little time to waste. It took the rest of the day to melt and shovel their way to freedom, and the ship limped back to the nearest port for repairs. With nothing else to do but wait, Zuko spent the coming days refining his fire-bending with his uncle, as well as honing the non-bending combat with the crew. The Avatar had been far more nimble than expected, and his small size gave him an advantage that the prince hadn't considered until he was being led around in circles in a vain attempt to land a hit. The close-quarters combat that Zuko had learned from Shing was ill-fit to face an opponent that was much faster and could soar through the air. Improvements had to be made to the fighting form, and to that end Zuko did his best to remember his encounter with the Avatar. Despite the bitterness of the crushing defeat, the men with him could not replicate the airbender's agility, but a degree of simulation could be achieved by having them throw a barrage of firebolts for Zuko to evade and strike. Uncle Iroh had been concerned about such an extreme regime, but the prince was not worried. After surviving the flames of his father, getting hit by small blasts from the crew felt no deadlier than harsh gusts of wind. Granted, Zuko would not be able to firebend at all if not for Shing's unconventional help. The trust he fostered with his prisoners was educational, and had given the prince a second chance at life. The Fire Lord's wrath had almost roasted Zuko's lungs and heart, to the point where just speaking above a raspy whisper seemed like an insurmountable challenge, and simply standing straight invited stabbing pain to his damaged organs. For a while, Zuko had to struggle with the fact of being virtually invalid for the rest of his life. Then the closest thing Zuko had to a friend had locked him in with some cackling waterbenders, and they'd healed him. Just like that, with no reasons or excuses given. Uncle Iroh had said it was a necessary subterfuge, but it took the younger prince weeks of pondering before he realized the ugly reasons behind it. Having both exiled princes be locked in with the 11th Regiment's prisoners for days. When put like that, it sounded like a grave humiliation was inflicted. Shing had masked his intentions of giving vital aid, and would continue to do so in the years after that. But why? Politics. Appeasement. Zuko did not truly mind the open whispers about that event, or being the subject of amusement or pity. But when he heard how his father had officially commended the colonel of the 11th for properly hosting his son and brother, the young prince felt a pang that hurt far more than the intense blast from the Agni Kai. Had he shamed his father that much to earn such spite? Was Zuko that much of a disappointment that Shing could only aid him under the guise of being a bully? Zuko spent many sleepless nights trying to trace the possible points of his failure in his father's eyes. Father had always been stern and harsh, and while he showed no pretense in favoring AZULA, there had been no clue of the depths of his wrath until the Agni Kai. Surely there was more to it than just speaking out against General Bujing. That act, however rude, could not have earned Zuko his father's ire, or his dark, unbridled glee when dispensing punishment. There had to be some past transgression the prince had overlooked, some unknowing offense. Or had his father simply had enough of Zuko's mediocrity? Was the lessons he took with Shing and the generals not enough? Uncle Iroh could offer little assurance. "I wish I knew what goes on in my brother's mind," he admitted sadly. "Hopefully, he will see the error he has made and recall you back in time." The words were a poor attempt at comforting him, and Zuko could only find comfort in the fact that the chance of regaining his honor and his father's favor was not as impossible as many made it out to be. If he pulled this off, maybe the Fire Lord might even be proud of him. "This feels wrong," a weathered commander said, shaking his head. "Colonel Youngsi," Sho just remembered. General Sho glanced at the man and gave a disapproving frown. "The results are undeniable." Someone else spoke up, a younger colonel that the general struggled to recall. Belonged to the 119th Regiment. But the honor and glory. Sho immediately snapped his attention to the officer. "By order of the Crown Princess, we are here to secure the North to allow the colonies to expand in peace, and to subjugate the Northern Earth Kingdom states. There should be honor and glory enough by simply being involved in this campaign." The young man quickly bowed his head and stepped back into the crowd of officers. "My apologies, General." Sho took in a calming breath before fixing the assembled commanders with a stern gaze. "Remember why we're here, commanders. To secure the Fire Nation's holdings. To expand it, even. There will be battles up ahead that will sate your need for merits, do not doubt that. But until then, do not waste the lives of your men and women on things like this." The words doused most of the bubbling dissatisfaction, But Shou knew that he needed to get to the first major stronghold to appease the battle-hardened and battle-hungry commanders who had tagged along with his army. Once they confirmed for themselves that they'd get the honors of taking castles and walled cities, letting Xing slit throats and scaring away conscripts would be far more palatable to them. As it is, they were 2 days out from the port city of Bailing. Admiral Dayong had its sea routes locked down, while Xing's 11th Regiment was clearing the way for the rest of the army. Villagers and small towns the Northern Pacification Army passed were informed of their new allegiance, and a small auxiliary force of the Crown Princess officials were left in its wake to get them acclimated to the change of liege. From what Shou understood, Crown Princess AZULA was looking to prove herself as much as a conqueror as an administrator to her father, and build an image of a proactive heir instead of a passive one as Prince Zuko was. Like how Prince Iroh served as a general under his father Fire Lord Azulan, compared to Fire Lord Ozai's less obvious service. If her plan here worked, she would likely earn the right to head the colonial ministry and get the chance to prove herself as a ruler. Control of the colonies would also enable her to establish herself in court politics, maybe even serving as her father's hidden hand in tempering some factions. Overall, it was a bold, ambitious plan with an end result that was highly laudable. Shou only wished that it was the prince who had taken such actions earlier, so that he might have staved off his father's wrath. But then again, rumor also has it that the Crown Princess planned this campaign as a loophole around Prince Zuko's exile, allowing him more havens to stop and rest in his impossible task. Shou tried not to bother with such whispers. Xing had said that the less people give credence to such a thing, the less of a chance the Fire Lord would take it seriously and act on it. Better that everyone thought the princess and her pet colonel were trying to overachieve to impress the Fire Lord. And to that end, Xing would continue building a dread reputation amongst the Earth Kingdom as a commander that preferred sneaking into camps or throwing mutilated bodies than engaging in conventional fighting. For the sake of compassion between siblings, young Xing was willing to bloody his hands and smear his reputation. Dao was right. It might be better planning for the boys' betrothal celebrations sooner rather than later. And maybe just have a quiet talk to him about precautions and discretion, in case he became a more literal pet of the Crown Princess. Shou would have to find a time when Dao and Koda weren't around, though. The stupid blowhard and the fencer might end up giving Xing the wrong ideas about proper courtship and intimacy. The general frowned as a dangerous thought settled on him. Would Colonel Wa be useful for such things? Dao grinned happily as he saw the walls of their first target at last. The burly colonel turned to his officers behind him. Right, lads, that there's Bailing, and I've won us the right to lead the siege since their gates are closed. We got the princess eyes on us, so make sure nobody does anything stupid like dying before we reach the walls. Understood? Yes, sir, they all bellowed, wearing smirks and hungry grins. The colonel's grin morphed into a more serious frown. You know the rules. Walls and defenders only. We're here to capture this place, not raise it. The only reason the civvies will be screaming is because they're scared they might get hit. Understood? Yes, sir. You find anyone doing anything other than fighting the enemy that's still not surrendered, mind you either stop them or die trying, because Dao did not want to deal with a pissed-off Xing again. Li Dai's disapproving frown made Dao feel bad and guilty. The boy's particular dislike for harming villagers and townsfolk, that scared Dao. It made sense, considering Xing's orphan past, but by the spirits did the boy know how to leave a trail of bodies that couldn't be tied to him. The last bunch of rapists Dao had freely, not out of pressure at all, no sir, pointed out to the 11th were found mysteriously hanging by a village square days after the 11th had moved on, their severed hands shoved up their asses and their balls stuffed down their throats. The camp physicians were confident that the poor sods were likely still alive up until they were hanged, though how conscious they were as they were violated with their own severed extremities was unknown. Knowing Xing, Dao bet they were fully awake and aware of every moment of it. Such was the price to pay for working with the young dragon that took Li Dai's teachings and took it to an extreme end. Not that Dao minded it too much. The boy knew where to draw the line between rape and seduction, and never intervened if appropriate justice was dispensed before he got to the guilty. And the terror that spread really decreased the paperwork Dao had regarding his troops' misconduct. With such punitive action being spread through whispers, it shouldn't be surprising then that Xing and his regiment managed to do rather well with the Earth Kingdom villages that knew of them. Dao had to admit that it made practical sense as much as ethical one, especially when he had adopted the same hard stance himself. Having villagers actually sell you their stores instead of going through the hassle of confiscating the stuff was far more preferable, especially with the lowered risk of poisoning and such. Plus, if you were nice enough, their ladyfolk were often amenable to business arrangements, and they could be very, very amenable. Dao looked forward to seeing if the ladies of Bailing would meet such lofty standards. Right then, standard Earth Kingdom walls with their gates likely reinforced with earthworks. Get the ladders ready. As ever, Dao took the position at the tip of the formation, with broadaxes in his hands. His personal guards each carried massive metal shields mounted on wheels that would protect their colonel as they advanced, and made for a fine surface to fight on if the earthbenders got too ground shaky. About a third of his whole regiment were similarly protected, acting as shields for their comrades right up until combat could be joined. Years ago, Xing had suggested the wheels, which admittedly made moving the things a lot easier. It still felt like cheating to Dao though, glancing over his shoulders to the banners of the other regiments just behind his. Dao almost cackled at the thought of Shou sweating his balls off from worrying too much as usual. Probably about casualties this time, he reckoned. Right then, Dao said as he focused back on the walls of Bailing. Xing's got his fun, now it's time for mine. The colonel raised his right axe high, and then slashed it downwards. Horns blared the orders for the Fire Nation's 4th Regiment to begin marching. The sounds of siege shields trundling along as boots stomped in unison stirred Dao's heart. Behind them, other regiments would follow up to a distance, and then open up with firebenders and archers to suppress the defenders. Dao would have told them not to worry about it, but Shou, the spoilsport, had been insistent. Stupid general's authority. They got within engagement range, and the advance slowed a little as small boulders and rocky spikes thudded and pinged off the metal shields. Dao chuckled as he savored the impotent sounds of the enemy's retaliation. As they drew closer to the walls, the hailstorm of rocks intensified, though only for a brief moment. Sticking to their end of the bet, the other regiments kept back and began to unleash a storm of their own, made of arrows and fire. Double time, boys, Dao roared, the shields adding a bone-shuddering reverberation to his words. Get ready to stick it in them. The shielded formations of the 4th Regiment sped up, but just as they were about to reach the final stretch to the walls, a rumbling boom sounded from behind them. Dao turned in time to see something zip over his head and cause an explosion of dust and dirt in a section of Bailing's walls. Remembering who he was working with, the colonel roared for his men to keep moving. Really, the boy and his toys. Another boom, and this time the walls gave way in a small avalanche of cracked stone and pulverized mortar. A third crash of another impossibly fast projectile tore open a gap and created a mound of dirt that could actually be climbed up to the rest of the walls. Stupid kids taking the fun out of everything. Dao couldn't help grumbling. Still, it was only one small breach, and plenty more were needed to actually make a serviceable beachhead. 4th Regiment, move your feet, before someone else steals our fun. With the defenders more confused and worried about the sudden collapse of their bulwark, Dao and his men had an easier time setting up the ladders. Firebenders kept back to provide covering fire as siege shields were abandoned in favor of swords and axes, and the non-bending soldiers began to climb. Dao too joined the ascent, almost literally yanking himself up the rungs of his ladder to quickly throw himself over the walls. Despite their confusion, the defenders put up a good fight, and Dao relished the battle. His burning axes crushed armor and shield alike to pulp the flesh and bone underneath. The hardened metal cleaved through boulders and earth-bended walls, which then allowed Dao to hack apart the earthbenders behind them. It would have been a glorious, memorable battle, if not for the enemy declaring their surrender mere minutes later. Dao had to redirect his axes with a grunt of effort when he heard the desperate calls sounding along the wall. He snorted away his disappointment at another barely satisfying fight, and then turned to the shaking soldier with his broken spear shaft before him. What can you do, right? Good fight, boy. Keeping away the axes, the colonel offered a hand to the young defender, who eyed him with plenty of confusion before taking the offer. Now be a good lad and join the rest of the surrendered group. All right? If you want, I'm up for dueling later. Leaving his troops to handle the cleanup, Dao looked over the walls to the Fire Nation army that was now marching into the open gates. He found Shou, and quickly slid down a ladder to make his way over to his general friend. Oisho, what was that? The bastard had the audacity to give him a confused look. What was what, Dao? Don't play coy with me. The fight could have lasted longer. Sho rolled his eyes. It's not my fault that Bailing's defenders decide to surrender when Xing Blue opened the gates. Freakin'. Sho leveled a frown at Dao. We're on a timetable, Colonel. So it doesn't hurt if we're ahead of schedule. As the colonel continued to curse and grumble, the general finally sighed. I tell you what, the next army we come across, I'll have Xing stay back and let you lead the battle. Dao gave his friend a look. 2. Knowing better than to haggle, Sho conceded with a shrug of his shoulders. Fine. Next 2 armies, you get the vanguard and Xing sits back unless things are problematic. I'll even let you lead the next 2 sieges. See if you can get the walls before Xing breaks them. Now that made Dao's eyes widen. Was that a challenge? It sounded like a challenge. Oh, it's on. Where's Xing? Gotta set the terms for this. Xing. Xing. Dao stomped away. All disappointment forgotten now that he had something else to look forward to. The boy had a new terrifying weapon to play with. But Dao would prove he would not be beaten when it came to breaking down walls. Gao consciously kept his breathing slow and silent as he slowly crawled towards the lights of the enemy camp. He grinned as he saw the slumped silhouettes of the guards. The Earth Kingdom armies had finally wizened up and reinforced their perimeter defenses at night. But the troops were paying an unexpected price for the hasty adoption of increased patrols. Just as how it took a significantly smaller amount of troops to man a fort and fend off an attacking force, so too did it only take a battalion or 2 to keep a whole enemy camp awake throughout the night. All it took was for firebenders to make themselves known by hurling flames over the walls, and everyone would have to wake up against the very possible threat of a night raid. Every now and then, the defenders would try sallying out to chase the harassers. Often, these attempts would only be a small improvised force, which made them easy pickings for the troops of the 11th hiding in the darkness to surround and silence. Firebenders would quickly jump up to snuff out torches and lanterns to maximize confusion before the slaughter commenced. If they sallied out in force, the battalions of the 11th would slip away into the night, taking out whatever enemy groups that were isolated enough. With the help of Gao and his fellows, the retreat had thus far been smooth and untroubled, despite how eager the enemy were. If the chance presented itself, a group of firebenders would also sneak into the emptied-out camp to raise the enemy supplies. And if the enemy was brave enough to ignore the harassment and kept to older, less rigorous security, the battalions would happily pick away at the more vulnerable patrols and find a way to slip in for some burning and stabbing. Then the defenders would still be forced to wake up, only now they'd be in a far worse state than before. Regardless, the overall result was a wary enemy who was forced to stay up all night, or even several nights, and were in poor condition for a pitched battle with the other forces of the Northern Pacification Army. Gao heard that some of the allies were complaining that the fighting wasn't fair, which was honestly stupid. They'd prefer a fair fight over an increased chance of living and winning. Gao had a girl and his parents waiting for him back in Yudao, so those pathetic, lonely virgins can take their honor and piss off with it. Thank you very much. At least the sentiment wasn't unanimous. Some regiments, most likely not made up of lonely virgins, were grateful for the dirty work the 11th Royal Regiment did on their behalf. Enough so that those in the 8th and 31st Cavalry took the effort to reserve prime camping spots for them when they had the chance. Gao was very sure that those people were particularly blessed with loving parents, spouses, and children. They probably were good damn partners, not like the honor-hungry, lonely virgins who probably saw their balls as useless dangling bits only meant for pissing. Gao didn't like those self-righteous pricks, but still, they were on the same side, so orders were to tolerate them. On the other hand, this bunch of Earth Kingdom soldiers were not on the same side, but the trooper felt bad for them. After the initial feint in the evening, they'd been forced to double their guards. Then, when the scouts of the 11th stole away a couple of patrols, the whole camp was put on alert up until the night. Poor shits. Gao could sympathize. Training in the 11th included a lot of trying nights as well. At least the Earth Kingdom fighters didn't have to go through naphtha endurance. A cricket song flitted through the cold air for a few seconds, and then Sergeant Loching in front of Gao and his team gestured with one hand, and everyone reflexively froze and held their breaths in anticipation. Gao counted 23 seconds before he heard groggy activity from the enemy camp. The guards snapped up straight with their weapons at the ready as they looked about in confusion. Then shadows could be seen dancing across the tents, probably of soldiers rushing to the other end of the camp to meet a supposed probing attack. Amidst the rising clamor, Gao heard the cricket song again, and Sergeant Lo Ching snapped out another hand gesture. Gao and two comrades rose up a little. It was time for the squad's earthbenders to do their work. With practiced effort, the trio focused on the ground below and around them, and very slowly shifted the dirt away to lower the entire squad into a considerable depression. Now able to at least kneel comfortably, Gao and the other earthbenders began to work their way towards the camp, carefully displacing the dirt and rocks in their way, making it look like earth was flowing around a bubble that encapsulated the whole team. The sergeant kept his head just high enough to take a peek and guide them, while the members of the squad of 20 kept their weapons and firebending ready. All it took was bad luck to spoil this attempted infiltration. They reached the earthen walls and were comfortably out of the guards' peripheral vision. Gao kept his breath even as the hard part came up. Sergeant Lo Ching gave a nod, and the trio pressed their hands against the base of the wall. Slowly, very slowly, Gao and his friends, well, he liked them enough to count, carefully shifted the dirt wall to compact them and create a tunnel. It was grueling work for both body and mind. One accidental burst of chi, one misjudgment of the rocks embedded in the walls, and the earth tunnel would collapse enough that the enemy would get alerted to their presence. Still, for all the taxing work, Gao wasn't going to complain. It beat having to actually use earthbending in combat, which meant having to duel other earthbenders. Gao was man enough to admit that he was not a strong earthbender, and he was ever grateful that the 11th Royal Regiment with its appealing pension and pay still took him in. They just needed him to move dirt instead of throwing boulders, and Gao would happily move all the dirt his sergeant ordered him to if it meant avoiding a straight-up, fair fight. Like right now, as they finally reached through the other end of the wall. Their first breach of the walls was a small vision slit to take a peek of the interior. Confirming that they were not in any place too dangerous, the sergeant gave the order, and the earthbenders quietly crumbled away the rest of the earth and widened up the tunnel for everyone to slowly crawl out. They found themselves at the edge of a bush forest of tents for the enlisted. The earthen huts of the officers could be seen further in, along with larger structures that probably served as storage and stables. The camp was a hive of activity, though it was all flowing towards the other end. Soldiers were hurrying along with their spears and shields and swords. Overlapping orders filled the air, and nobody was looking at this part of the wall. A glance to the side found another team making it through, and the sergeants exchanged hand language. "Get ready," Sergeant Lo Ching whispered. "As usual, go as deep in, then burn our way back here." Gao's hand mindlessly went for the naphtha jars hanging off his belt. Once more he felt bad for this bunch of enemies. The order was given a minute later, and both infiltrating squads began sneaking through the now emptied tents. A few soldiers were still stumbling out of their tent. The saboteurs quickly dispatched these unfortunates with blades and dumped their bodies back into the tents they came from. Eventually, Gao could clearly see the backs of the milling defenders, probably waiting for the Fire Nation's supposed raiders to break through. This was about as far as they could make it, and so the order was given with a sharp snap of the sergeant's hand. The whole squad started by first equipping their jars of naphtha, and after lighting the cloth wicks, the noxious jars were flung as far out as possible towards the clueless defenders. Before the jars had the time to land and break, the raiders then turned about and began setting fire to the tents by firebending or torches. They were quickly bathed in the warm glow of a waking firestorm as they worked their way back to their insertion point. The firebenders took up the rear as usual since they could tolerate the heat, while Gao and his earthbending comrades rushed to the wall to apply the finishing touches. With yells of confusion now rising to match the roar of the flames, the squad hurried through the tunnel, this time with the earthbenders pulling up the rear. Gao hurriedly undid the work he had done to tunnel in, loosening the dirt and allowing the ceiling to collapse in. With everyone now safely on the other side, the three earthbenders collectively forced a ripple through the wall to send it crumbling down in a particular way. To an uninformed eye, it'd look like someone had been taking pickaxes and shovels to sap the walls enough to make it climbable. With the sentries gone, presumably to check on the fires inside the camp, Gao followed his sergeant's silhouette into the darkness, their path now a bit more illuminated thanks to the raging fire breaching past the camp walls. Returning to base was fast enough, and Gao passed by the squads of the 2nd Battalions who would be taking over harassment duty. They'd probably have less to do, though, with the Earth Kingdom camp partially lit up. Not unless Captain Toshi decided to actually storm the camp for some reason or another. Gao headed straight for his tent instead of the mess tent. After all that earthbending, he prioritized some rest over a meal. Breakfast was a few hours away anyway. As he crawled into his bedding, Gao was glad once more for joining up with the 11th. He shared his tent with his squadmate Lim, a firebender, and his tent was grouped together with the rest of his battalion. If he had stuck with the safer option of colony guard, he'd be sleeping in a different area with the other earthbenders as a security precaution. Being an earthbender in the Fire Nation was depressing enough when it came to job opportunities. But joining the town guard was one of the more demeaning choices despite the marginally higher pay. Segregated quarters, a not-so-subtle ceiling for career progression, the hidden risk of being labeled an Earth Kingdom saboteur or spy if things went bad. For all the supposed prestige of being a patriotic citizen, defending one's home as an earthbender could suck real bad. Honestly, Gao and most of the earthbenders who had taken the risk of accepting the discreet offer of the 11th had expected about the same treatment, with only a higher pay to make up for it. But then the young colonel, spirits bless him, had walked the talk and treated everyone equally. Save for the different curriculum, because Gao couldn't throw fire obviously. They suffered in training together with the firebenders and non-benders, ate together, slept together, and fought together. Sure, his peers initially gave him and the other earthbenders some squinty looks, but the shared experiences had made them all brothers and sisters in arms. Some talented earthbender, Tian of the 4th Battalion, if Gao remembered rightly, was even sent back to the 11th's home island base recently for officer training. He'd be the first earthbending lieutenant of the Fire Nation military, and the colonel was vocally expecting more out of Tian, so he could make the guy a captain of his own battalion later. And not an earthbenders only battalion either. The guy might actually lead firebenders. Way to go, Tian. Back in the colonies, you'd be lucky to make sergeant for longer than a few weeks before they replaced you with someone more deserving. So it came as no surprise that Gao found his loyalties leaning more towards the regiment first. With the wise and forward-thinking crown princess, of course, may the spirits bless her too, and then his home colony Udao, and then the Fire Nation itself. The only small price right now was that the earthbenders wore the same markings as non-benders, and were prohibited from using their bending in the open, whether in the presence of allies or enemies. From what he understood, the 11th were using the earthbenders as secret weapons, partly to keep the enemy from reacting properly, and partly to ensure none of the more virginous allies tried to cause trouble with accusations of spies and saboteurs. Gao knew enough about the world to see the wisdom in the secrecy, and like every earthbender comrade, he didn't mind it at all. Oh, the other downside was the secret training with the prisoners. That General Yama was an unbearable prick, like an elderly uncle that kept yapping and deriding, and couldn't be acted against because of his age and experience. His bending lessons were good, but hell was the guy impossible to please. Captain Ren at least gave credit for accomplishing a hard task. Yama just treated everyone like they slept with his sister or something. Still, discretion and the noise of the old badger mole was a paltry price to pay for the camaraderie, respect, and, most importantly, pension and wages that the 11th offered. None of his comrades has yet called him a spy or potential traitor. Nobody had held Gao's earthbending against him. It was the kind of respect that Gao gladly obeyed orders and killed for. And if by chance things went to shit, he was pretty sure the colonel, at the very least, would have his and every other earthbender's back. As his exhaustion took him, Private Gao felt secure in the knowledge that he could sleep safely amongst the trained firebenders of the 11th Regiment. The progress of the Northern Pacification Army was going faster than expected. Clearly, they had overestimated the Earth Kingdom once again. Cities and villages were forced into the fold of the Fire Nation by a small army of administrators, while castles and forts were cleaned out and awaited their new fire-bending garrisons. All in all, things were going rather well. But AZULA found herself frowning, particularly at the message tacked onto the report. "This isn't a joke," she asked Ping, who had the decency to fidget a bit out of nervousness. "No, The captain answered with a shake of her head and a brittle smile. "Mosey is taking over until Xing returns. Thankfully, there isn't much opposition around for us to worry about." The princess quirked an eyebrow up and slowly stood from behind the desk of her royal office in the 11th Regiment's training complex. "I couldn't care less about the regiment's progress, Ping. It's its colonel that I'm worried about. Did Xing say where he went off to?" Another shake of the captain's head. "Only that he's working on avatar-proofing the plan." That bled off some of AZULA's anger. Avatar-proofing? Uncle Iroh had helpfully sent news of Zuko's encounter with the Avatar to AZULA about a week ago, masked under a regular report to a concerned sister. No doubt Xing had received the same message as well. There was much to unpack, from the fact that the Fire Nation's greatest threat being an airbender monk around her age, to the idea that this Avatar seemed unprepared for his role. But Xing had gone off on a ship to spirits knows where after receiving that information, and that he had Ping relay his departure personally to AZULA instead of just settling for a letter meant that the boy was probably regretful about his action. Not that AZULA would so easily forgive him, but avatar-proofing? Ren's voice broke the princess from her musing. "Think he decided it by himself?" Ping shrugged. "Dunno, but I'm not going to be surprised if it ends up being the spirits nagging him again. He gave us the new security measures to consider aerial security right after he heard of the Avatar, and asked us to make it subtle. Mosey is still talking with General Shou, but they'll wait for your approval before making the news public," which meant that nobody knew if the Earth Kingdom knew about this new development. Troubling, but promising. If Zuzu had the competence to quickly apprehend the Avatar, this would be a non-issue, but alas, her brother was headed back to repair his ship. Now they had to worry about the possibility of a flying Avatar seeking refuge in enemy territory. Still, AZULA had kept the news from her father. With how secure their encrypted messaging was, there was practically no risk to it, and it would give Zuko that little bit more time to restart his hunt. Before father decided to further punish his incompetence by opening Avatar hunting season to all comers, or something along those lines. Much as AZULA detested Zuko's weakness, Xing had been right. He'd been taking the right steps to rising above his incompetence, and that was something worth seeing through. If a recruit from the 11th could be turned into a proficient killer, then her brother could at least make for a half-decent prince. He'd still be far below AZULA, but at least the dum-dum could be a useful tool to further her ambition, especially after father's ill-advised duel and exiling of her brother. That act had garnered a disturbing amount of sympathy for Zuko, something that got in AZULA's way as she waded through court politics. The murmurings were faint, but they were definitely there. Her not-so-public attempts at offhandedly looking out for Zuko had garnered her some of these courtiers' support, but having her brother return would make the work a lot easier. Have Dum-Dum return, make a show of guiding him back into royal politics while rebuilding their sibling bond, then work on winning him over to her side. Give it a few years, and AZULA was certain he'd fully support her as heir, especially if she could foster his bitterness over father's punishment. It'd probably require her to offer the 11th to help search for mother, even if that likely meant finding her untimely grave. And if she could make him bitter enough, maybe throw in the opportunity to be officially adopted by Uncle Iroh, since they're so close to each other. It would require careful and patient politicking and social engineering, but AZULA was confident in her abilities, and that of her growing roster of talents. And she probably didn't have to worry much about wording things for father either. Zuko would be happy being mediocre, not weak at least. Father got to be rid of him, and AZULA would get to enjoy being crowned princess without so much second-guessing from the shadows. Of course, that all required Zuko's return to the palace, but with the Avatar now running around. You've no clue about what Xing might have meant by avatar-proofing. Unfortunately not, Ping confirmed. I think if we knew, we'd probably end up stopping him. But the captain paused to fish something out of her belt pouch, a piece of folded paper. Xing did ask me to deliver this to you as means of appeasement. AZULA took the paper and carefully unfolded it. She read through the message, quickly at first, then took a moment to fully process what had just been written before reading through it again, more slowly this time. "Everything all right, AZULA?" Rin asked. The princess glanced up at the two captains, her two surrogate elder sisters. Did Xing ever mention anything about Omashu? Rin and Ping exchanged confused glances before shaking their heads. We just kept up with the news on the south, but no plans were made. That made AZULA frown heavily. Xing just promised to give me Omashu after he's back, and the northern campaign is over. As an apology. Ping whistled while Ren's jaw dropped a little. Well, that explains why he preferred quick raids over drawn-out encirclements, the captain of the 4th Battalion remarked. Also explains why he didn't argue much with Dao and the other battle-hungry nutters about the sieges. Ren hummed thoughtfully. Well, maybe he got something out of the spirits. AZULA's frown turned into a scowl. The spirits better be giving him flawless directions. Sometimes, Koshi had to remember that his colonel, a rescued orphan, did not fully lead 11th out of obscurity and orchestrated brilliant strategies by himself. No mere boy, however prodigious, could come up with so many ideas or peer into the future as Xing did. That was not to dismiss his feats, but it was also irrefutable that Xing had some help, in the form of the whisper of spirits that only he could hear. And it required some reminding that such boons did not come for free. There were many tales of invisible benefactors aiding a hero throughout their journey, only to exact a significant price at the end, or sometimes even before the adventure began. Like the tales, Xing's capricious helpers were mysterious in their agendas. But thus far the advice they provided him had not only kept the regiment alive, but allowed the 11th to reach new heights. Yet Koshi couldn't help feel some guilt that it was a mere boy that had to shoulder all the burden of this exchange. These didn't seem like spirits that could be appeased by offerings or negotiations, but instead they clearly reveled in sending Xing to partake in senseless games, like the near-suicidal visit to King Bumi, or this seemingly pointless little expedition. And as Xing's renown grew, Koshi had no doubt that the delayed price of survival and prosperity would gradually increase. All the bodyguard could do was to stick with his colonel to lighten what little burden he can. If he could, Koshi would gladly meet with these spirits and offer his life in exchange instead. Xing did not deserve to selflessly burn himself playing confounding games for the sake of his regiment. Koshi took some solace in the fact that this time Xing had brought along an escort for his journey without any strong-arming required. Other than the bodyguards, the Han unit followed along the journey south. The crew of the corvette loaned by Admiral De Jong would not join them ashore. But thanks to their tireless work, it only took several days of speedy but boring seafaring before they reached their destination. Let's hope we have the right village. Xing sighed as he stepped off the landing boat and onto a pristine shore. He'd opted to skip the port, both to maintain a low presence and avoid dragging the locals into his quest. You'd think such a small, mountainous island would only have a couple or so villages. But no. So you've no clue where we're supposed to go, sir? Wufang asked as he scanned the shoreline. Other than being sure that it's on this island, no. Unless there's other places where they have people in white and green. Please don't tell me that's the case. Koshi smiled despite the chain-link veil covering his features. It's practically guaranteed that your description is of the Kyoshi warriors, sir. We're on the right island. Now we just need to narrow things down. Without scaring the locals, Xing added, and he then picked a random direction and began walking. Koshi, the other bodyguards, and the Han unit followed along in good order, weapons sheathed but otherwise fully armored. How they kept the villagers from running would be a problem for the colonel to handle. They quickly left the beach and entered a sparse forest, and immediately Koshi's hackles were raised. Eyes forward, Xing ordered, clearly having sensed what he did. It took the small force some effort, but they marched on with forced casualness. Feigning ignorance was the bodyguards nor the Han unit's strong suits. But with the amount of counter-ambushes they'd conducted, Koshi would like to think that they were doing a passable job. Sure enough, the threat appeared as they got deeper among the trees, far enough from the shoreline to effect a hasty retreat. Figures descended from the treetops, their green uniforms breaking through the scant canopy cover. The soldiers immediately closed ranks and drew their weapons, though Koshi had to lead his bodyguards to form a protective ring around Xing, who had rather recklessly walked too far in front. A quick glance told Koshi that they were surrounded, but far from outnumbered, though the enemy's full strength might still be hidden. The ambushers were all in deep green dresses with lacquer-armored cuirasses, spalders and vambraces, their faces painted in white and red. They wielded war fans and blades and small shields, adopting stances that Koshi was unfamiliar with. The vaunted Kyoshi warriors. Supposedly they were an all-female order, carrying lessons taught by the avatar Kyoshi herself. But considering the painted faces, Koshi couldn't exactly be sure about the claim of the former. That kind of rumor might be useful to make certain enemies complacent. And even if he was truly surrounded by only women, the way these warriors held their stances was not something to scoff at. "Soldiers of the Fire Nation," a voice called out, and Koshi almost winced as he realized it belonged to someone not quite an adult yet. She wore a more ornate golden headdress compared to the others, he belatedly noticed. "A squad leader, at the very least. Your kind are not welcome here." Xing pushed through his protective ring to face the speaker. "Please, I've not come for a fight," he said, actually removing his helmet in the midst of enemies for probably the first time. The colonel then offered a quick bow and salute of respect. "I am Xing, and I've just come to." The Kyoshi warriors stiffened noticeably upon hearing his name, and their leader all but hissed as she leveled her fan at him. "The Scorpion of the Fire Nation. In Kyoshi's name, your campaign of terror ends here." They lunged as one, though Xing had the presence to quickly bark an order before he dodged a strike. "Bruises only. Bruise a shit." Koshi scowled as he dove in to intercept a blade with his bracer, then sent a knee up into the armored plate of the attacker to drive her back. The spirits were cruel to ask for this sort of fight, but Koshi swore that none of the soldiers here would fail Xing. "Form up." He called out with his authority as a lieutenant to get the bodyguards and Han unit in line. "Closed ring. Bofang. Yen. With me." Leaving Quan to keep the Han unit organized, Koshi rushed to Xing, who was dancing around 3 of the painted warriors. He joined the fray with a flying kick that managed to graze a Kyoshi warrior, while Bofang simply tackled another shoulder first into the ground, and Yen literally cut into a slash with his own short sword. The bodyguards went to work protecting Xing's back, leaving him to deal with the enemy leader unhindered. These women were fast, and their fighting style was utterly alien, but the soldiers' battle experience more than made up for the disadvantages. Trusting in his armor, Koshi stepped into a slash from his opponent's war fan and felt the weapon rippling against his brigandine. Remembering Xing's orders, the lieutenant lashed out with one arm to grab at the woman's neck, though he had to quickly let go when another warrior lunged into the fray, aiming for his neck. Koshi grunted as his initial opponent capitalized on that and slammed her shield into the side of his helmet. It lacked the force to knock him off the ground, but the brief disorientation was enough to put him on the back foot. Yan's blade darted by him an instant later, knocking the women back and resetting the momentum of combat. Before the melee could devolve any further, a familiar blinding flash and its accompanying roar gave everyone pause. The Kyoshi warriors were all frozen in shock as they stared at Xing, but the soldiers of the 11th were already consolidating and preparing to land decisive blows. "Please," Xing called out loudly, with one hand around the neck of the enemy leader. "I don't want any casualties here." The colonel raised his free hand and pointed it at a nearby tree, incinerating it with a gout of white fire. "Otherwise I'd have torched this whole place from the start." The leader of the Kyoshi warriors struggled to break free, scrabbling against his arm as she tried to use her legs as leverage. Xing's grip proved stronger though, and the young woman remained bending backwards at an awkward angle. "We will not kneel to the Fire Nation," she gasped out, earning Xing's gaze, which was both apologetic and annoyed. "I'm not here to conquer, just to pass a message, and hopefully offer some advice." The colonel looked to the soldiers of the 11th. Weapons down, they all did as ordered, and after silent stare, the enemy leader reluctantly nodded as her throat was freed. "Stand down, Kyoshi warriors." A tense awkwardness settled on both groups as Xing began negotiations. As a show of good faith, and probably to keep the meeting's content more discreet, the Han unit were sent to wait at the edge of the forest, leaving the colonel and his bodyguards against the favored warriors of an avatar. "Say your piece then," the leader said curtly, almost spitting out the words. Xing still bothered to give another respectful salute. "If you do not mind, might I have your name?" The young woman looked unsure for a moment, glancing back at her comrades before frowning disapprovingly at Xing. "Fine. I am Suki, of the Kyoshi warriors." Koshi swore that the boy visibly relaxed, as if he'd found his quarry. Typical of the spirits to play such games. Xing bowed without any trace of mockery. "And as I mentioned earlier, I am Xing, though you've already heard of me, it seems. The atrocities you've committed are well known to us." Xing smirked at that, but he didn't reply to the accusation. "In any case, I've come to inform you that the Avatar has returned." The Kyoshi warriors almost reeled back as one, though Suki recovered quickly with a frown of suspicion. "And we're supposed to believe you?" As an answer, Xing shrugged. He will likely land here. But he is being hunted, so I'd suggest you don't host him for too long. Her frown increased, and the young woman finally gave in to the niggling question that must surely be nagging at the back of her head. Why are you telling us this? This time Xing's smirk was wide, almost becoming a grin. Because it's in my interest if Kyoshi Island does not become tainted by the war. I do not come asking for the island's submission, but I hope you're all at least open to, employment negotiations in the future. Even Koshi was wide-eyed with surprise at that. Why would we ever work for the Fire Nation? Because maybe there'll come a time when we're actually a better option? Xing immediately answered. Because maybe we might both be able to put aside our enmity to dispense a greater justice, at least for a while. What in the world was Xing insinuating? That there was a bigger threat than the war? You have your armies, why would you need us? I don't, came the unhesitating reply. But again, it'd help a ton, especially because we'll be likely dealing with Earth Kingdom victims. It'd be hard for soldiers like us to approach them, wouldn't it? Much better to have reliable, unfeared faces to look after them. Koshi found himself frowning at the clues, his mind struggling to piece together this vague scenario being presented to him. It surely couldn't be Omashu. The plans didn't call for any civilian suppression. In the meantime, Suki shared a silent, concerned look with her warriors, one heavy with a promise of a weighty discussion in the future. Then her gaze returned to Xing. Say that we believe you. You don't have to. If the Avatar arrives on your island, you'll have some proof of my word's value. When the request for aid of the Kyoshi warriors arrives, you are free to make your own judgment with all the news that will be bound to follow the request. Xing smirked a bit smugly. I'll be sure to make the truth clearly known when that time comes. To banish all ambiguity of the cause you'll be offered to join in. Suki's frown faded a little, but her suspicion remained. If what you say is true, then I can only promise to consider your words. Good enough for me, came the shrugging reply. Xing seemed happy enough, and was about to turn to leave before he paused as if remembering something. Oh, by the way, if the Avatar gets chased by a Fire Nation force led by a guy a bit older than myself, if his name happens to be Zuko, tell him that I hope he compensates any damage he does to this island. Quote me on that. The faster you get the message over to him, the less fighting you'll have to deal with, hopefully. Suki and the other Kyoshi warriors could only offer confused looks at that, while Koshi found himself exchanging equally clueless looks with his fellow bodyguards. If he still persists in being difficult, tell him that AZULA has plans for this island, and she doesn't appreciate him ruining it. Almost absently, the boy leaned back to throw a sideways glance at his bodyguards and whisper too loudly. She didn't. They left after that, with the confused Kyoshi warriors watching over them every step of the way. Koshi couldn't help his curiosity once they were almost back to the boats. What is it you're preparing for, sir? Whether the spirits bade him to be silent or whether it was Xing being unnecessarily obtuse about it. The colonel gave a wry smirk as he answered, War. To drain the secrets of Lake Laogai. Hopefully it'll get us a nice home.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.